welcome to My Baseball History. I'm your host, Dan Wallach. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. Today's episode is brought to you by the podcast Midnight Library of Baseball. Ben Orlando, the show's creator and host, says Midnight Library of Baseball serves two key purposes. First, to explore the fascinating and checkered history of an eccentric sport that screams its humanity with every origin and evolution story. And second, not to scream, to welcome listeners into a nighttime conversation without loud noises or music that disrupts the peaceful transition towards sleep. I've been a dedicated listener of Midnight Library of Baseball for about 2 years now, and that's exactly why I started listening. I just moved across the country, but all of my stuff was in a storage unit while I looked for a new home. That meant my usual bedtime routine of putting Seinfeld on and letting the sleep timer turn my TV off for me wasn't going to work anymore. My TV was in a different state. So I began looking for soothing podcasts that would let me drift off, but would still hold my interest if I didn't fall asleep immediately. Using Midnight Library of Baseball for that purpose lasted exactly one night for me. Ben's writing was so interesting, and I just didn't want to let myself fall asleep. Even though I learned about the show while it was already in the middle of its first season, I started listening at the beginning, with episode 1 titled, Did Lou Gehrig Have Lou Gehrig's Disease? It was just a little over 20 minutes, and then episode 2 started, which was titled, How Ray Chapman's Death Saved Future Lives. Needless to say, with those first 2 episodes, I was already hooked. But I knew I was going to have to listen to the show when I was fully awake because I just didn't want to miss anything. I have a feeling that if you listen too, you're going to feel that same way. In addition to producing Midnight Library of Baseball, Ben Orlando is an award-winning fiction writer. Ben's novel, Throwing a Butterfly into Your Neighbor's Mailbox, the Pilar Medina story, about a female knuckleball pitcher's quest for the big leagues earned him the William Faulkner Literary Prize in 2025. He also won first prize for his entry to the 2022 Fade-In Awards, which is a top Hollywood screenwriting competition. And that's what got me hooked on his show, the writing. Fans of My Baseball History who have been here since the beginning due to their love and admiration for Shoeless Joe Jackson are particularly going to love Season 2 of Midnight Library of Baseball, which is a 14-episode deep dive into the history behind Field of Dreams, from its start as a short story by W.P. Kinsella, to the casting and making of the film, to its lasting legacy. That season alone gives you more than 8 hours of content, including interviews Ben recorded with everyone from Academy Award-winning sound engineer Russell Williams, to casting director Marjorie Simkin, to baseball historian and Kinsella biographer Willie Steele, and even the film's director, Phil Alden Robinson. You can find Ben's amazing show, Midnight Library of Baseball, on all podcast streaming services, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. And now, you can also find short-form content on TikTok, or check out the website, midnightlibraryofbaseball.com. On today's episode, I spoke with renowned baseball historian and artist Gary Cieradkowski. Gary's book, The League of Outsider Baseball, An Illustrated History of Baseball's Forgotten Heroes, which he wrote, illustrated, and designed, was published in 2015 by Simon & Schuster. Gary is currently the editor of 21, the Illustrated Journal of Outsider Baseball. He's also the artist and writer behind the Infinite Baseball Cards Set blog, which has been one of the best baseball things on the entire internet since February of 2010. Gary has been a guest on NPR's Weekend Edition Saturday to talk baseball with Peter Simon, and he continues to be a featured speaker at book festivals and libraries across the country. Gary has been an artist ever since he could hold a pencil. While most design firms specialize in only one aspect of design, Gary opened his studio over a decade ago because he believes a true artist should be able to work in all disciplines, from branding and packaging to environmental graphics and illustration. The full extent of what he can offer can be found in the pages of his website, studiogaryc.com, where you will also find prints of his award-winning posters for sale and his brilliant baseball history writing. While his last name may be troublesome to say, his work speaks for itself. Gary is originally from North Jersey, but left when he was 17 to go to art school in Baltimore. Much of his work is baseball-related now, from portrait commissions and logos to apparel designs. Many of the older Ebbets Field flannel shirts are Gary's designs, but since they've stopped doing vintage creations, Gary's been working with Team Brown Apparel. Many of his Negro League and All-American Girls Professional Baseball League shirts are sold on their website, but they're also available in the gift shop of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and even in the Smithsonian. But more than being a celebrated graphic designer, Gary is a brilliant researcher. He does writing and research for several auction houses, specializing in high-end sports memorabilia and historical pieces. And like I mentioned, he writes his own publications, from his books and journals to his infinite baseball card set, where he creates digital and sometimes physical baseball cards which are included in his never-ending set of baseball's forgotten heroes: Negro League legends, semi-pro sluggers, barnstorming mercenaries, blacklisted bums, foreign phenoms, Bush League oddballs, and the famous before they were famous. When Gary writes about well-known players like Mickey Mantle, he's not going to tell you the story of the time Mickey hit a 565-foot home run at Griffith Stadium in Washington. That story has been told to death, from players on both teams being interviewed to the fact that Mickey's home run that day, April 17, 1953, is when the term tape measure home run was born. While Gary might tell you about some monster home runs, like the one Mickey hit on March 26, 1951, playing at Bovard Field in Los Angeles against the University of Southern California, which not only went over the outfield wall, but also cleared the football field behind it, landing an estimated 650 feet from home plate, the brilliance of Gary's research and writing comes in talking about who these figures were as people. He takes a magnifying glass to the long-told story of Mickey's father, Mutt, traveling to see Mickey while he was wallowing in the minor leagues to give him an ultimatum after Mickey called home saying he was thinking about quitting baseball. Either get your act together and start playing ball like the superstar I know you are, or I'll pack your bags for you and you can come back to Oklahoma with me and waste your life in the mines where you're going to die young and broke. There's a lot that we think we know about that story, but Gary's research and writing uncovers a lot that we don't, including trying to hammer down exactly when that conversation took place. Gary's writing, art, and research was recognized by the Baseball Reliquary in 2015 when he was named the recipient of the Tony Salin Award for contributions to baseball history, the highest honor a baseball writer, historian, and researcher can receive. And that's what makes him the perfect person to have this discussion with, which is one that I've been wanting to have with someone for a long time now. Gary and I are going to have an all-time fantasy team draft, picking one player we'd want on our team at each position from throughout the vast history of the game. Now, this is a long episode. I'm going to tell you that right off the bat. In fact, it is the longest episode in the entire 5-season run of my baseball history so far. But you're going to love it because we discuss so many figures from throughout baseball history. Not just players in the American and National Leagues, but also minor leaguers, Negro leaguers, All-American Girls Professional Baseball leaguers, international ball players, managers, executives, entertainers, and a bunch more people. And the best part is, the liner notes for this episode are going to be filled with Gary's brilliant artwork of everyone we discussed today. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, in this episode, we cover lots of ground. Gary tells us about his research process when writing about a player, which sometimes takes years before a story is ready. We find out how Gary creates his artwork, taking a piece from the idea stage to getting it onto the computer screen where he can fill it in with historically accurate colors, which he meticulously researches, and then how he makes the decision on which pieces he'll produce a physical baseball card for. We learn who the Negro League legend and Baseball Hall of Famer was, who Gary became personal friends with while living in Baltimore. And we hear Gary's stories about more than 50 people that he's researched and created artwork for over the years. With all of that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with the episode's liner notes on our podcast website. If you're new to the show, don't worry. You'll still be able to enjoy this episode without the extra help from the liner notes. But longtime listeners love the photos and links we put up on the website, which will give you a better understanding of the things Gary and I are discussing, and provide some context when needed. The liner notes can be found on the My Baseball History website, which is online at www.shoelesspodcast.com. If you want to follow along, head to the website where you'll see the Gary Cieradkowski episode listed first on the main page under latest episodes. Click on that and you'll be ready to follow along. There's an embedded media player right on the page, so you don't have to have multiple windows open while you listen or fumble around with multiple devices. If you want to catch up on any of our earlier interviews, you can click on the tabs at the top of the website to go back through past episodes from any of our 4 previous seasons and see a full list of everything we have to offer so far. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should easily be able to keep your place as you listen. After the interview, we'll do a recap of what you just heard, adding some extra insight and hopefully answering any questions that may have come up as you listened. I'll also explain how you'll have a couple chances to answer a trivia question to win a prize, so stick around until the end of the episode for that too. But now, here's my interview with renowned baseball historian, author, and artist, Gary Cieradkowski. You grew up in northern New Jersey in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and because of where you lived, you were a Mets fan, and that was a pretty awful time to be a Mets fan. So how did their futility kind of spark your interest in learning about baseball history?
Well, when I was a kid, my father and his father and my mother's father were big baseball fans. And I mean, everybody in my family were big baseball fans. But in the 70s and early 80s, when I talked to my father or my grandfathers about the Mets, you can only say so much until you get really angry and swears start flying. So I started asking my father and grandparents about the teams and the players when they were growing up. So, my father grew up in the 50s and the early 60s, so he would tell me about Willie Mays and Duke Snider, and his favorite was Warren Spahn. Then my grandfather, his father, he was a diehard Brooklyn Dodger fan going back to 1916, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So he would tell me about players like Jersey Joe Strip and Van Lingo Mungo and, all these guys that had these great nicknames.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to go to the library and find books on old ball players and try to research the players that my grandfather would tell me about. And that's how I got started.
And what age were you when you're like starting to actually do research? Because it's one thing to listen to your grandfather and your dad tell stories,
Mm-hmm.
but it's another thing to take it upon yourself to be like, I want to learn more, because this is before the internet.
Right.
So like, it's not like you could just go to a different room in your house and sit at the computer, and like, you had to go to the library.
Sure.
So how old were you when this was happening?
Boy, maybe 11, maybe earlier than that. I guess the beginning of the real big research was when I figured out that they had old newspapers at the libraries, and they still had them in those big bound editions.
Yeah.
So I was a kid, and I'm pulling these big bound editions that the librarians would give me to look at the Newark Star Ledger from 1935 or something like
Cool.
that. And it was great. And plus, I love to read it. I read from an early age. And it wasn't just baseball, but you'd start reading the front pages. And I just loved history. So baseball was a way to live history.
Yeah. You mentioned that your dad and grandfather both grew up Brooklyn Dodgers fans. Your dad in the 1950s and your grandfather in the 1920s. Who was more excited about the Dodgers winning the World Series in 1955? Your dad, who would have been like 6 years old at the time? Or your grandfather, who had been alive for at least 7 National League pennants at that point, but had never seen them win? Between the two of them, who do you think was really more excited about them winning?
My grandfather was the bigger Brooklyn Dodger fan. His big thing was he lived up until 2002. And to the day he died, he never referred to them as the Los Angeles Dodgers. They were always the Brooklyn Dodgers. And that caused a lot of problems when I was a kid growing up because, I'd go to Old Shea Stadium to see the lousy Mets. And my grandfather would be talking about the Brooklyn Dodgers. And I'd be thinking, why can't we just take the subway over to Brooklyn and see a real ball club? And then, as I got older, I realized my grandfather had screw loose. When it came to that. He just really loved his Dodgers.
When they moved to California, did your dad and your grandpa vow to never root for them again, or did they just...
My dad became a Milwaukee Braves fan.
Okay, because I was going to ask, how is his favorite player Warren Spahn? But okay, that's
see,
the new team
my
you picked.
family's kind of strange because my grandfather, his favorite football team was the Cleveland Browns.
Okay.
And it's solely based on hatred because he hated the New York Football Giants.
Mm-hmm. Did he hate the New York Football Giants because he hated the New York Baseball Giants?
I don't know why. He just hated certain things in life. And boy, he really hated the football Giants. He didn't like the baseball Giants either. Then he really hated the New York Yankees. And he passed that down to my father. Now, my father's favorite ball club became the Milwaukee Braves because in 1957,
there you go,
they beat the New York Yankees.
Yeah.
So he was a lifelong Braves fan after that. So.
Cool. Do you think either of them really ever got over the Dodgers moving out of New York?
I don't think my father cared either way. Like you were saying, he was young when, I think he was 6 or 7 when they left.
Tell me about some of the players that you heard about from them, like Van Lingo Mungo you mentioned, and I've heard you mention him in other interviews specifically relating to your grandfather telling you stories about him. So when you were researching him on your own, what kind of stuff did you find out about him?
He's one of my favorite players, and I finally got to do a long-form story on him this past year because I had been collecting stories about that guy for decades. Mm-hmm. I don't even know where to start. I mean, this guy was just a nutcase. He couldn't stand Burleigh Grimes, who was the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers in the late 30s, and he wanted to get him fired and he didn't want to pitch for him. And Grimes got mad in the clubhouse one day and threw a Coke bottle against the wall, and the glass broke. Well, Mungo takes off his shoes and starts jumping around on the glass, hoping that he was going to cut himself so bad that the management of the Dodgers would fire Grimes because their ace cut his feet up. He was just a prodigious drinker. You know, in hindsight now, it's kind of sad. I mean, the guy obviously had an alcohol problem, but they really just gave birth to some of the most hysterical stories of this guy. The big famous one when the Dodgers were in spring training in Havana, spring of 41. End of the previous season, Leo DeRocher, who was the new manager of the Dodgers, suspended Mungo for being drunk and out of shape. And so Mungo cleaned up his whole act, quit drinking cold turkey. He was in the best shape he was ever in the spring of 41. And he's scheduled to pitch a exhibition game, I think against the Cubs. Just by chance, the game gets rained out. What does Mungo do? He winds up in the bar and falls off the wagon again. Gets pretty wrecked. And at one point, he starts waving his money around and he says, "Bartender, I want to buy everybody here a drink, including those two miserable guys at the end of the bar." Well, the two miserable-looking guys at the end of the bar was his manager, Leo DeRocher, and the general manager of the Dodgers, Larry McPhail. So they suspended him. They got him a boat ticket for the next day to go to Montreal, which was the AAA team at the time. So the next morning, they're at the docks, and Mungo's not there. He misses his ship, and nobody knows where he is. Well, later that night, he winds up being with a hostess for the club in the hotel, and one of the dancers from the featured husband and wife dance team that was headlining at the time. And the three of them got all tanked up, and they wound up back in one of the ladies' rooms. And everybody swore nothing happened. Mungo was just drunk and passed out, and they didn't want him to sleep in the hallway or something like that. Who knows what really happened. But anyway, the husband of the dancer, he couldn't find his wife. Finally figures out she's in this room with this ball player. He was Spanish, and he supposedly was a very hot-headed man, got a machete, and showed up in the room. Nobody really knows exactly what happened, but the dancer wound up being thrown through a closet door, Mungo naked, running through the hotel. The cops are called, running around the hotel, after an armed man with a machete and a naked man. Somehow, Mungo got away, and the next morning, they got him a boat plane ticket to Miami. But they had to hide him out in a warehouse until the pilot of the Pan Am plane gave him a signal, because there was police and soldiers on the docks looking for him, because he was a wanted guy. So finally, at the last minute before the plane was ready to take off, the captain signaled him, and he ran down the dock and was able to get on the plane and get away. But he went down to AAA and never was back with the Dodgers after that. But It's one of those all-time great baseball stories.
When was the first time you remember seeing or owning a baseball card?
Ooh, I don't know. They were just kind of always there when I was a kid. I guess that's...
Did your dad collect, or your grandfather?
I don't think so. They didn't have much money back then, so that was kind of a luxury that they couldn't really afford. I know I found a couple of old football cards in the attic of their house once. So, I mean, he must have, but it wasn't really a thing with him. They were just always around when I was a kid, I guess, because I was the oldest kid in my family, I guess you would say. I guess people would just gift them to me, as a boy. And so, yeah, they were just always around.
Yeah. You went to the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore and graduated in the class of 92. What was the first graphic design job you got while you were still a senior in college?
Oriole Park at Camden Yards.
How did that happen?
Place.
That is an incredible first job.
Yeah. What happened was, it was the summer before my senior year. Back then you could get an internship, and they weren't arranged by the school or anything. You had to find it yourself, and then you would get a couple of credits for it or something. So I was trying to find a graphic design job, and I just started looking around for graphic design shops in Baltimore, and I had my portfolio. And I knocked on the door of this one, and I happened to have a bunch of baseball stuff in my portfolio. Well, just by some crazy chance, they had just landed the contract to do the graphics for Oriole Park at Camden Yard the day or two before I showed up on their doorstep. And the owner didn't particularly care for baseball, really know much about it, and nobody else really did there either. And so they were like, well, do you want to, you could be our intern. So I'd show up once a week, and then the next week I'd show up 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and I was working full time by October, I guess.
I mean, you had a whole baseball stadium worth of graphics to do, right?
Yeah, it was a great experience. It made my career. The best part was working with Janet Marie Smith.
Yeah.
she knows her baseball history in and out. So she was able to say, like the dugout roofs in Wrigley Field. And I would know exactly what she's talking about. Or she'd bring up something about Ebbets Field, and I knew exactly what she was talking about. She didn't have to explain it or show pictures. So we kind of had that type of relationship. Yeah, obviously, we were both very passionate about the history of the game. And that's, I think, the biggest driving factor that made Camden Yards so special. It was the people that were working on it were people that really cared about the game. They weren't just architects or some design firm that you found the cheapest bidder or something like that. These were people that really cared about the game and cared about the environment that you sat in and what it looked like and what it felt like.
Yeah. Your resume also includes the logo for the 1993 All-Star Game at Camden Yards, as well as the signage for the redesign of Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia. So you're working on Camden Yards while you're still in school. You get the gig to make the logo for the All-Star Game the very next year. Were you just like, man, this whole real world stuff is pretty easy?
No, I knew how fortunate I was because there was a bad economic decline in 91, 92, 93. So most of the people I graduated with, they didn't have design jobs when I got out of school. So I knew how fortunate I was. And because I knew that and I knew what the job market was like when I got out of school, that's why I skipped a lot of my classes my senior year to go into work because I knew that was the way I was going to be employed after school. And I almost failed out of art school at the very end.
But so what? If the point of school is to get a job and you already got the job, then
that's the thing,
there's no reason to keep going to school.
Yeah, I mean, I could work on fake logos for fake companies for a grade, or I could design a baseball stadium.
Right.
So everything worked out fine, and I graduated.
When you were working on the All-Star Game logo, were you getting directives from people of like, this is what we want it to look like? Or did they just say like, you've seen what the other ones look like, figure it out? No,
because at that time, now they just have the same people do the same logos every year, and it all looks the same. Back then, I don't know how they decided. Maybe it was just whatever team was hosting it that year. If their design agency did it, and just because the Orioles were hosting it, I got to do it.
Yeah.
And that's why they all look different at the time. Now everything's kind of this.
It was the same thing with like the Super Bowl logos were all uniquely different for every game, and they each had like the local flavor.
Yeah.
And you can look at a Super Bowl logo from the 80s, and you're like, okay, this is when this game happened.
Yeah. When I did the original logo I did for the All-Star Game was really cool looking. It had this batter swinging, and that's the one we sent off. And then it came back where they took my batter off and stuck the Major League Baseball logo on it. So that kind of rankled me a little bit because we had it animated and everything. It was really cool.
Cool. When you were living in Baltimore, you became friends with Leon Day. Tell me how that happened, and what's your favorite memory of that friendship?
I was interviewed for working on Camden Yards in 91, and the guy that interviewed me for the television station was a fellow by the name of Dr. Bob Hieronymus. He has his own radio show now, 21st Century Radio, it's called. If you've ever seen the movie Woodstock, the documentary with all the bands, the VW bus, the famous one, he painted that. That's his bus.
Amazing.
Yeah, so he was an artist, but he was also a huge baseball fan, and he loved the history of the Negro Leagues. So when I was being interviewed by him, I don't know if I had a book on my desk, or I don't know how he found out that I was interested in the Negro Leagues, but we just hit it off after that. We're still very close friends. But at the time, he was involved with an organization of Negro League players, mostly East Coast-based players from the 30s and 40s. And through them, he knew all the players that were still alive. He was a philanthropist, and he gave a lot of money. Didn't make a big deal about it. If somebody needed an operation or something like that, he would give them the money to do that.
Cool.
We started talking about that, and he said, well, do you know who Leon Day is? And I said, sure. And he goes, well, he lives right by you in Baltimore. So he drove me over there one day and just dropped me off. And he's like, Leon, this is Gary. He's very interested, and takes off. And Leon Day invites me into his row house, and went upstairs, and he had like a little den with some of his mementos and things. And I just got to talk to this guy. But the most interesting thing about him was he would never talk about himself. And I went over his house many times after that. So I would kind of research him. I'd go to the archives of the old Afro-American and find articles on Leon Day. So I'd have kind of ammunition to ask him about his career. Because like I'd ask him about pitching, and he would say, well, I was okay, but this guy was even better. And, he would always deflect it to somebody else. I guess my most memorable story that he told me was because he pitched a no-hitter opening day 1946.
And that was his first game back from the war.
From the Army, yeah.
He had missed a couple years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I figured that would be the most exciting game or his best thing that ever happened to him in baseball, but it wasn't. It was pitching in the 1945 GI World Series in Germany right after the war.
Wow.
He beat General Patton's Third Army. They had put together this all-star team of all the white major leaguers that were serving in Europe at the time and wangled transfers from other units to put them all into this one team. And Leon Day, he was pitching for they're called the WASE All-Stars. Mm-hmm. It's OISE, which is a part of France where they were stationed, however you pronounce that. But what happened was that team was just a bunch of semi-pro players, minor league players, and then Leon Day and Willard Brown, who were two star Negro League players.
Yeah, Willard Home Run Brown.
Yeah. And most of the other guys were just, nobody really famous. But the guy that was the manager of that team that put them all together, he was a former Brooklyn Dodger and a union organizer, and he was really into civil rights before civil rights were a huge movement. So he went out of his way to bring those two black players onto this team. So it was probably one of the first integrated Army baseball teams of all time.
Yeah, wow.
But anyway, this scrappy little team from nowhere actually made it through the playoffs and beat Patton's Third Army. And Leon Day's favorite game was the one where he beat Ewell Blackwell, later star with the Cincinnati Reds.
Cool. You were kind of instrumental in helping Leon Day get inducted into the Hall of Fame, right?
That was more Dr. Bob. If you talk to Dr. Bob, he'll say that I had a big part in it. I mean, I did a lot of drawings and graphic design and stuff.
But that's part of it, making that PR push to get people to know, like,
Yeah,
this is somebody worth actually considering.
It is, but Dr. Bob really, because he was a television personality, he was able to get these things in front of people that should have them. I mean, I was just a 21-year-old kid at the time, so I didn't have that pull, but Bob did. And he was relentless. I mean, the stuff that guy went through, I won't share any names, but there was a baseball announcer at the time, radio and television guy. Dr. Bob is trying to tell him about Leon Day, and this guy was just such a scumbag. You know, there's no statistics. Those guys weren't any good, but Bob didn't blow his top or anything. He would just keep going and going and going until he got the people that were the right people that got his name on the ballot. And finally, he was voted in about a week before he passed away. He found out he was in the hospital. And I remember Bob giving me a call when the Hall of Fame vote came in. That was great. It was great to hear that.
You've said that your grandfather actually watched Leon Day pitch for the Newark Eagles. So what kind of stories did your grandpa have about him or about the Negro Leagues in general?
Both grandfathers did. Didn't really say anything about it, just that it was great baseball, you know. They didn't really make much of a distinction between it being black ball or minor leagues. The Newark Eagles played in Rupert Stadium in Newark, where the Yankees' top farm club played, the Newark Bears. So when the Bears weren't in town, the Eagles played there. So, you know, to those guys, it was just a good baseball game.
Yeah, just another game to go to.
Hearing those stories, that's the thing that really got me interested in the Negro Leagues as a young kid, because I would go to the library and there'd be no books on it.
Yeah.
You know, who were these guys? What were the Newark Eagles? So I would go to the newspaper archives and find it that way. Go back to like 1940 or something like that and start looking through the sports pages. And the Newark Star Ledger, I guess, was one of the papers I used to do it. And sure enough, there it is. There's the teams and the box scores, and you know, and that's how I learned about the Negro Leagues. And then later on, I guess in the mid-'80s, there was a lot more books that came out on the Negro Leagues. John Holloway, his stuff is great, his interviews.
Yeah.
So.
One of your pieces of Leon Day showed a beautiful image of his 1937 Newark Eagles hat, which then inspired Will at the Ideal Cap Company to create that hat and make it available for sale. Tell me about your relationship with Will and what you kind of think the baseball world has lost since his passing.
Yeah, Will, he was, I always call, he was my first client ever. I was, I guess I was 18 years old. I was a freshman in art school. And I saw a Sports Illustrated article on him and how he made these beautiful old caps. I think they were $40 at the time. And I was like, man, I'll never be able to afford something like that. But I would just sit there and pore over these pictures. And I sent away for a catalog, and there were these little baseball cards that came in the mail. I think his ex-wife used to draw them. They were just so cool, and I would just stare at them nonstop. And finally, I had enough money to order one. Then I thought of something else, you know, before computers. And so I wrote a letter to him and I said, if I do illustrations for your catalog, will you give me some free hats?
There you go.
And he wrote back and he said, yeah. So my entire sophomore and junior year, I would just draw hundreds of baseball caps for Will, and I'd get, you know, 3 in the mail and another 3. And
cool.
I just have tons of those old ball caps. I think they're the greatest thing in the world, especially when you compare them to the ones today that have, I don't know, what do they have, like 7 logos on them now and everything. And
yeah.
they're all stiff, but these things are just little tiny works of art. They're gorgeous. You know, and my father was in the garment industry, and that's where Will got his start too. So we kind of had that as a bonding experience. I've moved around my whole life all over the country with my career. Will started off in Cooperstown. He had a farm up there. He would go to Bisbee, Arizona in the wintertime. So wherever I was in the country, he was always passing through at least twice a year. And we'd get together and just have one crazy night together.
Cool.
And when he passed away, that was just one of the hardest things because his attention to detail, there's just nobody around anymore that produces any type of ball caps or clothing or anything like that had that attention to detail that Will had. I mean, he would just research the heck out of everything, and his files were just full of all kinds of notes, and it was just great talking to him. Plus, he was just such an interesting guy. Just one of my best friends. And the baseball world really lost something with that. I don't know if it was New Era or one of those big cap companies were offering to buy his archives of all the old logos and stuff that he had meticulously put together, and he was thinking about it, and I was like, man, well, you shouldn't do that because they're just going to ruin everything.
Well, look what happened with Mitchell and Ness and what's happening now with Ebbsfield Flannels. Like, they had that attention to detail and sold, and now it's not the same. So,
it's a shame. You know, I don't know if it's just the market. I mean, maybe people that cared about that stuff are all just dying out now, and I don't know, it didn't get handed down to the younger kids or something. Or I don't know, maybe the market's open for something like that again.
Do you know what happened to Will's archives? Like, who owns them now? Who has them?
I don't. I know he had a son. But as far as the papers and all that stuff, I don't know. I really hope it went someplace good like the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. So clearly you're using references for your uniforms because those are extremely accurate down to the lettering style of the words or placements of patches. But do you use reference photos that you're recreating with your cards, or are you inventing the pose and the background and everything about the image that you're creating when you're making a piece?
I'll use photographs if they're available. A lot of the players that I do illustrations of are kind of obscure.
Yeah.
You know, and some of them there's just really bad photographs. But I meticulously research as best as I can all the uniforms. It's easier with the major league stuff and some of the minor league stuff. But I mean, you know, if you're trying to find the Norfolk Mary Janes from 1902 or something like that, it's hard.
Yeah. As
far as my illustrations and poses, I very rarely will use one photograph directly with no other source and just copy that. To me, it's just boring. And I do it because I love doing it. If I get a commission and somebody says that they want it to be just like this photograph, I'll do that. But the stuff I do for myself and my website and everything else, I try to research the player as best as I can to kind of get a feeling of what that person would be like in real life. Like, how would that person stand if he was in the room with me? You know, would he lean on the bat? Would he lean against the wall? What kind of expression would he have on his face? You know, would he be looking to the left or the right? Or, you know, would he look angry? You know, would he crouch down? You know, I try to, like, you can't get all that by just copying a photograph. Or at least I can. I could kind of get that from knowing about the player as best as I can and seeing as many photographs. And it sounds weird, but I try to visualize what that player would be like if they were standing in front of me and, like, what the environment would be like, because that's how I come up with the backgrounds. I figure, where would this guy be standing in the stadium? Would he be in the locker room, you know? And what would that look like?
I love the Easter eggs that you put, especially in the signage and the backgrounds of a lot of your images. Is there a way that you decide who gets what, or how does that work for you?
Well, in my book, the portrait of Leon Day that I did, if you look in the background of that, there's a factory building, and it says Hieronymus and Company, which is, you know, my friend Dr. Bob, who introduced me to Leon Day and got me started and all that. So, I mean, that has a connection, obviously. I have a subscriber to my booklet series from San Francisco, and he wanted me to do a San Francisco ball player, and I did Smead Jolly. And then in the background, I have his name on the wall.
Cool.
Yeah, things like that. Yeah. And then I try to see if anybody picks it out, you know.
One of the things I really respect about you is your insistence on getting colors right on uniforms. How do you go about doing that research to make sure that you're being accurate? And more importantly, why is that something that matters so much to you, especially when it's a uniform that no living person has ever seen and nobody would know if you got it right or wrong in the first place for a lot of the things that you're making art for?
I don't know. To me, the hunt is an integral part. It's one of my favorite things to do is try to figure out what the colors of these old teams were. The painter Greg Kreindler and I go back and forth all the time about colors because he's as meticulous as I am.
Yes.
And I've never met him in real life, but we talk all the time via email. I'll get an email from him at 3 o'clock in the morning where he's working on a painting and I'm up doing something. And he's like, Pittsburgh Crawfords, 1935. What do you think that color would be? And, I go through my files and try to see what I have. And sometimes I have it, sometimes I don't. And we'll both start hunting around. Or he's really good with Major League Baseball uniforms. So if I'm doing a Major League or a minor league player, I'll ask him and chances are he has it. And we both try to figure out what a color would be in black and white photography.
Yeah.
And I'm colorblind. So I think that sort of helps me out a little bit. Or maybe I just have a good imagination or something like that. But Greg and I will go over like gray tones, like what that would equal in a photograph. We try to get it as accurate as possible.
Yeah, that's even crazier about how big of a stickler you are for colors, that you are colorblind. How can somebody possibly do what you do and do it so well without knowing what the colors look like?
When I first started in graphic design in the early 90s, you didn't have computers. You had Pantone color book, PMS books. And every color was assigned a number. And because I was colorblind, I went and I memorized the entire Pantone book. So if somebody would say at Pantone 122, I knew that was sort of like a mustardy orange-yellow type of color. So that's how I do my drawings on the computer now, is I'll figure out what the CMYK breakdown would be, the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And I could tell if there's 10% cyan, 15% magenta, so on and so on, what that would be. So I might not see it in my head, but I know what it is.
So you're just a savant.
I don't know if I did it out of necessity because if I never told anybody I was colorblind early in my career, nobody would hire me,
right?
Especially before computers. I mean, if you spec the color out and they ran with it on the press,
it better be right.
Yeah, and if they didn't, man, you're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Those things are expensive. A print run back then, you didn't have these cheap presses that they have now. That was expensive. I usually had like one person I could trust nearby where I could be, if I really had a question, like matching colors or something like that was always hard for me. So I always had somebody I can surreptitiously ask.
Because I've noticed sometimes that the skies in some of your art are strange colors, but I always just assumed that it was kind of a subtle nod to the T206 set, which famously had oddly colored skies in many of the card backgrounds. But you're telling me all this time is just because you've been colorblind and you don't know what skies are supposed to look like?
Sometimes, yeah.
That's so awesome. I love that so much.
And it's kind of been, I don't know what you'd call it, like a trademark of my drawings now.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, I came across your work, and most people on social media know you for your baseball artwork and research, but you have done way more than just baseball because your actual job is as a graphic designer, which you've done now for more than 30 years. In addition to all your baseball work that you've done, your credits also include Barnes & Noble's music department and the Folgers coffee can. Are there any other non-baseball projects you've worked on that you're allowed to talk about that you're really proud of, or things that like you think define your career maybe?
I did a redesign of bicycle playing cards.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody remembers bicycle when they were a kid. And the original design kind of devolved over the years. I guess new designers would work on it and they dropped details over the years. And so like the company I was working for at the time, LPK, we got that job and we kind of were able to bring it back to just beautiful typography and nice design, put a lot of those nice details back into it. If you saw both of them side by side, most people really wouldn't bat an eye. But if you know what you're looking for and you do see them side by side, you're like, oh, that's actually a beautiful package now.
Yeah. You've been working on a project which you call the Infinite Baseball Card Set since February of 2010. You describe the Infinite Baseball Card Set as a never-ending set of baseball's forgotten heroes, Negro League legends, semi-pro sluggers, barnstorming mercenaries, blacklisted bums, foreign phenoms, Bush League oddballs, and the famous before they were famous. What was the impetus for you to initially start that blog?
It goes back to when I was a kid with my father and my grandfathers, with just the interesting stories about ball players. And my dad, I moved away when I was 17, but no matter where I was, I would always talk to my father at least 3 times a week. He worked in the garment industry, and I would call him at work all the time. I still remember his telephone number. And, sometimes my dad would call me, and he read the New York Daily News and the New York Post every morning. So I'd have like odd trivia things in there about baseball. Sometimes we talked for an hour or something like that, and sometimes my dad would just call me up and without even saying anything, like, do you know who Victory Faust was? or come up with some trivia question, and most of the time I'd get it right, and he'd get all mad and he'd start swearing, just hang up the phone, So, but we talked like at least 3 times a week my whole life, and then it was right before the 2009 World Series. He passed away suddenly, and I was living out in Hollywood. And none of my friends liked baseball. My dad was my big outlet to talk about baseball with, and suddenly he wasn't there anymore. And I was really missing him one night, and I use a computer for work, but I do most of my things by hand, and I'm not a very tech-savvy type of person. And I knew what a blog was, and I just started missing my father, and I was like, yeah, what the hell, I'll start a blog. I think it was WordPress or something like that. It was really easy to set up. And I did a quick drawing of Leon Day, like a guy that I would want to talk to my dad about. Mm-hmm. So I put this little drawing up on this blog, and it was just sitting there by itself, and it looked kind of silly. So I wrote a story to go along with it. Who was this guy? Just as I would tell it to my father. And then a couple of days later, I missed my dad again, and I did it with another player. And a week later, another player. And I just did it for myself, I don't know, like a month or 2 later, all of a sudden I looked at the stats and all these people, and I started getting people writing to me, and these are great stories, and it just kind of caught on from there. Yeah, it was, I guess it was one positive thing that came out of my father passing away.
Yeah.
But I was able to keep my dad alive in my head through these little stories. And that's how I continue to write my story. I'm not an academic writer by any stretch. And I try to make all my stories like I'm sitting next to you in a bar and I'm telling the guy on the stool next to me a story, and try to keep it as entertaining as possible.
You first posted that Leon Day card on Sunday, February 21st, 2010. Does it feel like 16 years ago already?
No, not at all. I still remember doing it. That's so fun. I'm surprised you got the real date. Yeah. Huh.
You have a style that is so uniquely yours. Obviously, it's easy when you depict someone in a baseball uniform, but I can even tell it's you when you've done like a hockey piece or when I see one of your pieces showing someone in street clothes. How did you develop that style? And is there a piece looking back in your portfolio where you can identify like, okay, yeah, this is when it started. This is the first piece that looks like Gary C.
I'm an illustrator, so I worked in gouache paints. Colored pencil was my big forte, and then just regular black and white pencil and pen and ink. When I did that Leon Day drawing and my other baseball drawings originally, I just did it in my spare time. So I had to come up with a style that I could do very quickly. If I was doing a portrait of a ball player in colored pencil, it would take me a day or 2 days or something to get it to the point where it's finished. But with these little baseball drawings, I just wanted to do it really quick because I couldn't spend time on it. I wasn't being paid to do it.
Right.
So through trial and error, I came up with just a black outline, which I draw in pencil first. And then I do it in black ink. So it's kind of like if you just see that drawing by itself, it looks like an uncolored coloring book. And so I do all that by hand, and then I scan that into the computer. And then that's where I drop colors in. I'll usually have like 6 or 7 sheets of paper that I do. It's kind of like a silk screen, like, how a silk screen has different screens for each color. That's kind of what I do for the big bold colors. And then for the details, I just finish that off in the computer with different colors. And I never really did anything like that before. Like I said, I did everything by hand. But it was just through necessity, and which is funny now because I rarely get commissioned to do anything else. So the original drawings were a lot simpler, and as the series went on, the drawings get more detailed, and I added more colors. Originally, I would just limit myself to like 4 colors sometimes, just for fun, because I was doing it for fun.
Right, yeah.
And then as it went on, I was like, how detailed can I get with this? So the drawings are a lot more detailed than they used to be. But that Leon Day drawing was probably the first one that I hit on that I was like, yeah, I like this style. This could do for this.
Yeah, in October of 2024, you published a series of articles detailing your process for creating the cover of Saber's Baseball Research Journal. So I'll link all 5 parts of that series in the liner notes for anyone who's listening and wants to follow along there. Does your process differ when it's a piece you're making for yourself compared to one that you're being commissioned to make? Like, you created the artwork for this podcast, which you've also previously written about. Do you remember anything about that process?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, you gave me like a little pencil sketch of what you were thinking about the locker room and the microphone on a yeah. So I mean that was easy because you sort of had an idea of what you wanted it to look like. So that was basically just putting it in my style and I guess adding dimension and everything else to fill it out. Other times I get a commission, somebody will be like, my uncle played for the St. Louis Browns minor league team in 1932 or something, but they'll have a picture of their uncle that was taken 30 years later at a family reunion. So I have to try to figure out what that person would look like when they were younger, and then figure out what team they were with. And of course, there's no baseball pose, so I have to try to figure out what that guy would look like,
Right.
as a ball player.
Yeah.
So it's a big range what I get from clients.
Let's say there's someone listening to this right now who before today has never seen your work. If you could only show them one piece you've done to be like, this is what I do, is there a piece that comes to mind?
Man, that's a tough question. I never thought about that before. You brought up the Satchel Paige Sabre cover for Baseball Research Journal. I guess maybe that one. I really like that illustration.
Yeah, me too.
There was a lot of research that went into that.
Clearly.
And I guess I would say that one because, as you said, there was that 5-part series of how I did it from the drawing all the way to the finished piece. I think that would be a good way of showing what I do. I think that would be the piece I would show.
Cool. One of the things that makes it so cool to me is that your style has been the same this whole time. You can look at a card from the set in 2011 and a card from 2021 and a card from 1 month ago, and they all look like they're from the same baseball card set because your artistic style hasn't changed. And I think the layout of the card that you designed is perfect as well. It's somehow both modern and classic. Have there been times over the past 16 years when you've been tempted to change the layout of the card?
No, when I developed that, I had a few things in mind that I wanted to do. A traditional trading card is 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. I knew what I wanted to do was make it a size that you can't fit in anything. So I made it slightly taller than a regular one, so you can't put it in a sheet or get
it's like
it.
the 89 Bowman set.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And it's thinner, too. And I always like the old tobacco cards, that vertical shape. So my idea was if people actually had these cards, you couldn't put them in a folder. You couldn't do anything with them. You could just put an elastic band around them, like you did when you were a kid, and that's what I wanted. I probably came up with 5 or 6 different layouts originally to try to figure out exactly what I wanted. But once I settled on it and I realized that I went through like all the contingencies about names or what needs to go on it, after I figured that out, I just never changed it. I just thought it worked perfectly. And I can't really think of... If I did change it, I'd do something that's trading card size, I guess, to help people out. Because I get a lot of people that collect my things like, oh, man.
Maybe you just need to start commissioning your own plastic sheets.
I thought about that, actually. And I'll have to show you this later. I actually came up with an idea how the booklets and the cards will fit in something to go into a binder that people can use. Yeah, I just came up with that this week.
Do you view digital artwork differently than physical artwork? Because I know you don't actually produce a physical baseball card for every single player who you create a card for in the Infinite Baseball card set. So how do you determine who gets a physical card and who doesn't? Like, why do you feel like creating a physical card is important at all for some of these guys and girls?
I don't know if it's important. It's just players that I like, I'll do a card for. But as far as being digital, I like things that are in real life. I don't like looking at a computer too much, although you have to nowadays. So I like to be able to hold things in my hand. And I know most of the people that follow my work are the same way. And then you also get people that just like to read the blog online and whatever works for anybody. And so it's kind of like there's a couple options. But for me, I'd rather have something in real life to hold and see what it feels like.
Plenty of artists do lots of research for their pieces, but they usually just let their art speak for themselves afterward. But you actually do a lot of writing with your work, from the backs of the cards that you create, to blog posts, to articles, to the card booklets and full-blown publications. How long does it take you between hearing a name or a little tidbit of a story about someone new and then turning that into full-fledged research to produce a card for your set or write an article about them?
It depends. A lot of the times I'll have a file already on a player. The file cabinet, which is right behind you, is just filled with player profiles. And so, sometimes I'll get an idea for a ball player and I'll write his name down and I'll put him in a folder that says ideas number 7, scraps of paper. Because sometimes I'll be researching something and I'll be looking through an old newspaper and the story next to it is actually more interesting than the story that I'm researching. So I'll make a copy of that and make a note for later on. And then when I get enough information that I collect over time, when the file, I think, is ready to develop into a story, I'll usually take that file and maybe 10 or 15 other ones. Like, say, I'm going to California for Christmas. So I'll take 10 or 15 files when I go out there, and I'll read them on the plane, and I'll figure out which ones have enough or which stories I can get a good hook for.
And so out of those 10 or 15 that you bring on that trip, do 2 of them become cards? Do 10 of them? Like, how does...
I think all of them eventually usually do. Out of the ones I'll bring at Christmas this time, maybe 2 of them I'll deem I have more research to do. I know that there's probably 2 or 3 that I have right now that I have more than enough. And it's just which one I really want to do first, I guess. Yeah. And sometimes I'll already have the drawing done. I'll do the drawing years before I actually do the story.
Interesting.
Sometimes vice versa. Sometimes I write the story first.
There have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 major league players at this point, now that certain years of the Negro Leagues are considered major leagues. But add into that all of the minor leagues, town ball players, industrial leagues, outlaw leagues, women. There are literally probably 100,000 or more people who have played baseball dating back to the 1800s who all have their own story. So how do you go about choosing whose story is one worth telling?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I guess just something that speaks to me. Like I said, I try to write my stories like I'm sitting next to a person at a bar telling a story. So would that be an interesting story? You know, I mean, you could take somebody like Roberto Clemente. I don't necessarily think there's a lot of interesting stories about him that I would pick out to tell somebody at a bar. But then there's somebody like Sig Jakowski or something like that from the 44 Browns. Most people never even heard of him. But boy, you could go for hours with stories about him. Or somebody like Lou Gehrig, I always thought he wasn't very interesting. But then I found that he played semi-pro baseball in New Jersey under an assumed name. And all of a sudden, that made him really interesting to me. So until I find a really interesting hook, that's how I'll select somebody.
I feel like I know some very obscure names from throughout baseball history, but there have been so many times over the years when I've gotten your newsletter or seen social media posts of recent work that you've done, and I've never even heard of the person you're writing about who has an incredible, unique story. Where are you coming across these names and those stories? I mean, are you just throwing a dart at an old newspaper calendar and being like, okay, October of 1921, there's got to be something interesting that, like, how are you finding all this stuff?
I read a lot. I mean, I'm just a voracious reader. You know, all the books in my library here, most of them are baseball books. And a lot of the times I'll read a biography of somebody and it'll be a one-line throwaway mention of some teammate that a guy had on the 1927 Yankees or something, or somebody played within the minor leagues. And I'm like, wow, who's that guy? And then I'll start digging into that. So a lot of the times it's things that you kind of just find on the way to something else, I guess. Or a lot of the times people will write to me and say, have you ever heard of so-and-so? No, I haven't. You know, and so I'll start looking into that. They just come from different places, I guess. And then, like I said, sometimes I'll be looking through a newspaper and the story next to it's even more interesting.
Yeah. Do you kind of have a self-imposed ratio that you try to adhere to when it comes to the amount of well-known major leaguers you write about compared to the amount of more obscure players you write about?
I mean, I know like if I write about Lou Gehrig or something like that or Joe DiMaggio, a lot of people will read it just because everybody likes comfort reading about players like that.
But that's not what really seems to interest you.
No, as long as there's an interesting story behind it.
Yeah, I mean, clearly you've done a lot of major leaguers and a lot of famous major leaguers, but like, I think your niche is that you draw these stories of people that, like I said, I've never even heard their names, sometimes never heard the league that they play in. So is there like a ratio that you try to aim for?
No, I guess I try to keep it more 50-50, but I don't know if I do or not. Like I said, I think it's just whatever story seems most interesting to me at the time. That's probably what I'll do.
Jason Schwartz has called you the hobby's current Bob Laughlin, and I'm not one to argue with Heavy J, but I personally think you're our generation's Mark Okinen. From the uniform research and the artistic angle with his Dress to the Nines project, to the obscure player angle with his 2,000 Cups of Coffee research, and just his general love of telling stories and preserving the aesthetic of certain periods of time throughout baseball history. I've just always seen so many parallels between the two of you, and frankly, I can't think of any higher praise that I could personally give you than to say that you remind me of Mark Okinen. Is he someone that you've been aware of or someone whose research has helped you over the years?
Oh, sure. I have lots of his books on my bookshelves. I mean, I still remember when I got Dressed to the Nines. I was in art school when that came out. And I mean, that research that guy did before computers.
Yes.
All those meticulous little drawings. I mean, what an outstanding piece of work that is. Yeah. What an undertaking. I mean, you can't say enough about his work. I will say this one thing. When my first book came out, the bookstore down the street from me would handle autograph requests, for signed books. And one time I went in there to sign a stack of books that they were mailing out, and one was for him. And I was like, oh, man, that's the coolest thing in the world. And I really wanted to write something, and I kept his address, but then I didn't want to seem like a creep and do that, so I never did. But, boy, I got the biggest thrill out of that.
Yeah. You seem to gravitate toward players with interesting names or fun nicknames. Did everybody 80 years ago just have wild names, or do you actively seek out names that you think are going to catch people's eye?
No, it just so happens that most of the interesting players had really cool nicknames. You get lucky that way, I guess. Or, sometimes I'll be reading a newspaper or something like that from the 20s, and there's this guy with a really cool nickname, and I'll be like, oh, that's interesting. So it'll catch my attention that way. I don't usually go out of my way to find players with interesting nicknames. I just luck out that way.
Yeah, that's funny. You've said that you use baseball as a vehicle to teach people about American history. If you had to pick one story that you've written to teach somebody why baseball history is American history, is there one name or one story that you've written about or one player that you researched that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, okay. One of the files I'm taking with me to California next week is this fellow by the name of Carl Butch Glass. And he was born in Lexington, Kentucky in the 1890s. He was a black guy, and he was a farmer. His family were farmers. When he was 16, he joined the U.S. Army, and he was in the 10th U.S. Cavalry, which was a colored regiment back then. And he got stationed in the Philippines to start off. And he learned how to play baseball while he was there. Now, at the same time in the Philippines, you had guys like Bullet Rogan, and most of the guys that became the early Kansas City Monarchs came out of the 24th and 25th Colored Infantry.
Adam Dorowski has done some research. That team was called the Wreckers,
Yeah. So at the same time, Butch Glass was in the cavalry in the Philippines, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and then also in Arizona later on, he switched to the 9th Cavalry. And he became a star pitcher for the cavalry team, which I thought was really interesting. And through somebody like that, you learn about how the Army was segregated back then. And it was really interesting, too, because that was one way that a black man could carve out a really interesting career for himself. At the time, the black regiments were the best in the United States Army, at the best looking uniforms, spick and span. Their drill was incredible because they had to be that good because there was only 2 regiments of cavalry and 2 regiments of infantry at the time. So to be accepted into those regiments, you really had to be on the top of your game. And the same thing with the baseball teams. In the white regiments in the Navy at the time, they all had baseball teams and swimming teams and, all these athletic things. In peacetime, that was a sign of a really good outfit if you had a good athletic team. So there was a lot of trading back and forth between regiments. I'll give you this guy if you give me this dude. And that's what happened to Carl Glass. He got traded from one cavalry regiment to another one. And that's how he started off his professional baseball career. Before the 1920 Olympics, they were having the Olympic trials in St. Louis. At the same time, a lot of the guys that became the Kansas City Monarchs were in St. Louis because the Army sent a bunch of teams there to compete in the Olympic tryouts, and Carl Glass was one of the guys that went. He actually played a game, I believe, with the St. Louis Stars, a Negro League team, because he was in town at the time. And that's how he got discovered when he was discharged from the Army in 1920. I believe he played with the Stars originally, and then he went to the Memphis Red Sox. Most of his career was in Memphis, just unfortunately with really lousy teams. But he was a really good pitcher. He often got compared to Satchel Paige, which a lot of players did too. But when you look at his numbers, his win-loss records aren't great, but the inside numbers are fantastic. But after he retired as a pitcher, he went and became manager of the Cincinnati Tigers in the early 1930s. And it was because of the leadership that he learned in the military. First, he was a manager with the Red Sox and then with the Cincinnati team. After that, he retired and went back to Kentucky and started a bunch of semi-pro baseball clubs. And they played the traveling Negro League teams when he went through town, using his connections when he was in the Negro Leagues. But the interesting thing about him is later on, after the integration of baseball, or actually right before it, in 1945, he started a team that was called the Lexington Hustlers. And just by chance, it became integrated because one of the black players on his team was friends with a white player, and they needed a shortstop or an infielder and asked him to play. So boom, just like that, the team was integrated, and the white guy would bring some of his friends. And supposedly it was the first integrated team south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Wow.
This was 1945, 1946. And Carl Glass was right there for it. And then later on, he became a scout for the Baltimore Orioles. His whole career kind of shows the rise of the end of integration, what life was like before that, and the civil rights era, and just how everything became more mainstream. Really interesting character. And the role of the military at the time, what that did for the esteem of African Americans. So Carl Glass kind of embodies everything about America in the 20th century because he was there and he lived it and he was a part of it.
Yeah, that's incredible. One of my favorite things about having followed you for all these years is seeing your sense of humor and your playfulness come out in your work sometimes. Not just with the stories you write, but sometimes in the people you choose to highlight, which has included fictional characters on occasion like Roy Hobbs from The Natural or Sam Mayday Malone from Cheers. Tell me about Joe Schlabotnik.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I used to love reading Peanuts in the newspaper. And some of my favorite ones were where Charlie Brown was playing baseball. Charles Schultz grew up in Minneapolis. He was a huge Millers fan, which was the minor league team back then. And then later on, he moved to the Bay Area, and the Giants were his team. And he would write about a player named Joe Schlabotnik. And he was just this hapless player in the Green Grass League in the minor leagues. And he wound up with the San Francisco Giants eventually. Mm-hmm. I took the few panels that Charles Schultz did, and he's kind of like an underground hero for a lot of baseball historians, and people that like Peanuts. So I was like, what would that guy look like, and what would his whole story be like? So I did an illustration of him with the early 1960s San Francisco Giants. And, of course, this guy that batted 0-0-1, he has this very heroic Casey at the bat type pose, which is the exact opposite of what he was. But when it came time for me to do the story, I was talking to my wife, and she's a huge baseball fan. We were sitting out on her porch one night, having a couple of drinks, and I was telling her about this story. So we came up with the idea that it was going to be kind of like a guest author that I made up. And the story is being told as a guy who grew up, and Joe Schlabotnik was his favorite player, and he's talking about meeting him. And I put the facts that I knew about the actual player from the cartoons into this. And this guy's actually telling the story. At the end, you find out it's actually Charles Brown, who's a psychiatrist. And he wrote a bunch of self-help books about dealing with destructive friends like Lucy and things like that. So my wife and I just had a great ball with that. And it's one of my more popular stories now.
Yeah, it's a fun one. In 2011, you joined forces with famed Negro Leagues researcher Gary Asheville and Major Ron Hill to create a beautiful 15-card tribute to one of the greatest black ball players of all time, Hall of Famer Pete Hill. How did that come to be?
When I first started my blog and started really getting serious about researching, two of my favorite researchers were Gary Asheville and Scott Simkus. Mm-hmm. Those guys had this short-lived, much remembered and revered Outsider Baseball Bulletin newsletter. Those guys are just, like I said, my two favorite researchers. They were great when I would write and ask questions about certain things that they already had written about or researched. And so I just struck up a friendship with both of those guys. And Gary, I believe he knew Major Hill first, and that's how we came about doing that card set.
What has it been like to work with people like Major Ron Hill, who's Pete Hill's great nephew, or to hear stories from the living relatives of some of the ball players that you've written about, like the family of Paul Gillespie?
Yeah, it's great because most of it, I think I've gotten like a couple of real negative ones. People being angry with stories that I wrote or just didn't happen. Oddly, both of those times, whatever story I told did happen.
Of course.
I sent the proof.
You're a researcher, yeah.
But most of the time when I cover a player and their family is still alive, they're really excited about it, especially the more obscure players. Every once in a while I'll get a letter from somebody. It's like, oh my gosh, this was my grandfather and I didn't know anything about him and he died before I was born and thank you so much for doing this.
Cool.
And yeah, so I love those letters when I get them because people are generally really happy to know the whole story or stories that they hadn't heard before.
In 2016, you created the logo for the Seamheads Negro Leagues database and subsequently for their ballparks database. How important do you think the work is that they're doing there, and how has it helped you do what you do?
Yeah, their Negro League database is just incredible. Before Baseball Reference had it on their site or Major League Baseball got a hold of it, those were the only guys that were doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, that work was it still is so important, and they're still updating it.
And they still have things that are exclusive to them because Major League Baseball only recognizes the certain years.
Yeah.
So, they have all the other years that aren't officially, quote unquote, recognized.
Yeah, absolutely. And Scott Simkus and Gary Asheville were two of the big guys that were driving that. I use that website all the time. I was really happy to do the logo for them. That's my way of saying thank you for all the work that they put in.
Your first book is called The League of Outsider Baseball. What advice did your wife give you when you were trying to decide how to write that book?
Well, I didn't know what to do at first, whether they should all be famous players that everybody heard of. But like we talked about earlier, that's just not interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And I remember, again, I was sitting out on my porch with my wife having a couple of drinks. And she said, just do the book that you want to find on a bookshelf. And that's what I did. I included all the players that I always wanted to tell stories about. And there is a handful of Hall of Famers in there, or people that you've actually heard of before. But I tried to put a twist on their story and tell something that you normally wouldn't know about them. So that was the greatest advice I ever got from my wife, besides actually taking the book deal.
Yeah. Do you have an idea of how many cards you've designed over the entire history of the Infinite Baseball card set?
No. No, I really have no idea.
Do you know how many you have produced into actual cards?
No.
All right.
I don't. I tend to be a completist, not so much anymore, but like with records or things like that.
Yeah.
I want to have everything. And I want to have it all in order and stuff. But with baseball cards, I don't. I consciously did that with this. I just wanted it to be this random set of cards. But that drives baseball card completists insane. I still get angry letters from people like, how come there's no checklist? There's no numbers on these cards. Because I wanted it to be like, you know, if you just like Negro League players, you could just have a set of Negro League players. It's not like it's card 7, card 18, card 19.
Right.
You could just mix and match, or just ex-New York Yankees or something like that. You could do whatever you want with it, which is the way I go about doing it myself.
The set itself is infinite, but also the possibilities of how you collect the set are infinite.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's get into something now that is an episode I've wanted to do for a long time, but I just didn't know who the right person would be to have this conversation with. But after knowing you for a number of years now and following you on social media and seeing all your posts for even longer than that, your love and knowledge of baseball history is pretty clear. So you're someone who it makes total sense for me to do this with. I call this the ultimate fantasy team. And we'll take turns picking our ideal players until we each have constructed our ultimate fantasy team. We'll both be picking 5 pitchers, 1 player for each defensive position, and since this fictional team would play in the American League, that means the designated hitter would be in effect, so we'll also each pick a DH too. But in addition to picking the roster, we'll have a few more selections to really round out the franchise and the stadium experience. So that means we'll both pick a manager for the dugout, as well as somebody to be our team's pitching coach and somebody to be our team's hitting coach. And we'll need our crowd to be excited to root for our team, so each of us will also pick one famous fan to be the face of our crowd. And just in case we can't actually watch or listen to all 162 games all season long, we'll need somebody who we trust who can be the ultimate fantasy team's beat reporter. So if you want to play along with us at home, you can look at this however you want to when you make your picks, whether it be the person you think was the best ever at that position, or somebody who is just your personal favorite player, or somebody who you wish you had seen play or you knew more about, or even somebody who you just think would be a great locker room fit for a team like this. For the teams that Gary and I are creating, we're only selecting players from the pool of cards that Gary has already included in his Infinite Baseball card set. So that way the liner notes for this episode will be really cool because they're going to be full of Gary's artwork for all of the people that we talk about. If you're playing along at home, you don't have to adhere to that part, but you should definitely check out the liner notes because they're going to be awesome for this episode. The other thing you should know as you're listening at home is that I'm going to be exclusively picking from the major league players that Gary's covered because it's always interesting to hear the new stories about people that you feel pretty familiar with. But Gary will be highlighting some of the lesser known people that he's researched over the years to hopefully introduce you to new players or new leagues. So all these people will have incredible stories that he just wants to share with us, and I want him to be able to showcase the breadth and depth of his research so you really get a feel for how amazing he is at what he does. Some of Gary's picks are going to be major leaguers, but many are not. Do we have any questions?
Nope.
All right.
Let's do it.
Okay, so if you're listening at home and you want to construct your own ultimate fantasy team before listening to our discussion, hit pause now and fill out your list, and then hit play when you're done, and you'll hear Gary and I reveal our teams. So let's start with our pitching staffs. I like to switch off with handedness for my starters if possible, so the other team doesn't really get a chance to get in a groove by playing the same lineup or seeing the same delivery multiple times in a row. So I went lefty, righty, lefty, righty, lefty. The ace of my staff is going to be Sandy Koufax. In 1959, Koufax struck out 18 Giants in 9 innings and set a major league record for strikeouts in 2 games with 31. In 1963, Koufax led the league in wins with 25, in ERA with 1.88, in shutouts with 11, and in strikeouts with 306. He won both the Cy Young Award and the National League Most Valuable Player Award that season. Yogi Berra once said, "I can see how he won 25 games. What I don't understand is how he lost 5. The 6-time All-Star would go on to win 2 more Cy Young Awards in 1965 and 66, finishing second in MVP voting and leading the league in wins both seasons. He won 5 straight National League ERA titles from 1962 to 66 and led the Dodgers to the National League pennant in 1963, 65, and 66, winning the World Series in 63 and 65. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Sandy Koufax.
My favorite thing that I learned about him was when he signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers, his bonus was enough money for him to finish architecture school at the University of Cincinnati. He didn't,
Right.
I don't think he thought he was going to really make it as a major leaguer, but he really wanted to be an architect. That's why he was at the University of Cincinnati. So he made sure his bonus was enough to cover the rest of his tuition. A lot of people know that story. But another thing in his contract was he had the Dodgers kick in a set of old uniforms to his team back in Coney Island. And the Dodgers actually gave him a set of 1946 or 1947 silk uniforms that they wore for night games at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all these kids that are 14, 15 years old, and they got these uniforms, these huge billowing satin uniforms. And I read an interview with somebody that actually played on that team that said we looked really silly, but boy, we look good too. So that's my favorite Sandy Koufax story.
That's amazing.
He just didn't stop thinking about his friends back home.
Who is the ace of your staff? Who's going to be your first pitcher?
I'm going to go with Big Carl DeRose. He's a guy that never made it to the major leagues. He was in the Yankees farm system in 1942. Then he got drafted into World War II. He was in the Air Corps, and he got out in 46, was playing in the minor leagues, had a really good season with Kansas City, which was one of the Yankees' top farm clubs at the time. Went to spring training with the Yankees in 47, and they figured he needed a little bit more seasoning, so they sent him back to Kansas City. Well, he blows his arm out, just totally destroys his arm. Doctor said he'd never pitch again, and don't pitch again because it's going to cause permanent problems, and the pain was just incredible. He didn't want to see his baseball career ended, and he was begging the manager of the team to please let me pitch one game, and the manager was like, no, because he's probably going to lose that game because you can't pitch, and he didn't want to do that. Well, DeRose finally went to his office and started crying and said, please, just give me one chance. Well, the son of a gun goes out there and throws a no-hitter. The pain was just excruciating, but he throws a no-hitter, and that's the last game he ever played in organized ball. So he's my number one starter, because if a guy could do that, he's starting my rotation.
Yeah, that's pretty special. For my second pitcher, I needed a right-hander, and I went with Christy Mathewson. He was the first great pitching star of the modern era and is still the standard by which greatness is measured. Using his famous fadeaway pitch, what today would be called a screwball, the 6'1", 195-pound right-hander baffled batters with pinpoint control. He won 20 games in his first full big league season in 1901, posted at least 30 wins a season from 1903 to 1905, and led the National League in strikeouts 5 times between 1903 and 1908. He set a modern-era record for wins by a National League pitcher with 37 in 1908, a year when he completed 34 of his 44 starts and wrote to more than 390 innings pitched. In the postseason, Mathewson pitched 3 shutouts in 3 starts in the 1905 World Series. From 1903 to 1914, Mathewson never won fewer than 22 games in a season and led the National League in ERA 5 times. Tell us what you learned about when you researched and wrote about Christy Mathewson.
Yeah, his famous fadeaway pitch. There's probably like 18 guys that get credit for teaching him that pitch.
Right.
Everywhere from Rube Foster in the Negro Leagues to all these other guys in the minor leagues and then in the major leagues too. But apparently it was just some guy named Williams, who was a left-hander that was playing on one of the semi-pro team. He was playing on one summer when he was in college. He had a pitch that was the fadeaway, and Mathewson picked it up and never really did anything with it. He would just throw it in his spare time. When he was in the minor leagues with Norfolk, I think he lost his first 3 games and his career was really going nowhere. And the manager of the team just happened to see him throwing this crazy pitch in practice. And it's like, what is that? And explained this guy Williams taught it to him. And he started using that in games, and the rest is history. It's just funny that what would have happened if he just didn't show anybody that pitch. It was
Right.
just something he screwed around with in his spare time, and he just would have been another nameless minor leaguer that nobody knows about.
Yeah, pretty incredible. All right, and then who is your second pitcher?
Pat Scott.
Cool.
I put her at number 2, and the reason is it's kind of a cautionary tale for myself or for any researcher. She lived about 1.5 miles from where we're sitting right now. And I lived here for many years. I've lived here actually 2 other times during my career. And she was always right nearby, and I always wanted to interview her. Pat Scott was a pitcher in the All-American Girls Baseball League in the 1940s. And I just thought that'd be really interesting to interview this lady. And I just never did. I talked to her a few times trying to set something up, and we just never could. And she finally passed away. And I missed that opportunity, and I swore I'd never do that again. So the first woman ball player I ever did a card of was Pat Scott, because I figured I had to do that. I owed it to her. I owed it to myself. She just seems like one of the most interesting people that I never interviewed.
Yeah. For the 80th anniversary reunion of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, you created artwork for 9 of the teams and some other accompanying logo and graphics. Why was that a project that meant so much to you?
I guess aesthetically, their hats used to drive me insane because they were so lifeless.
Yeah.
Like the Rockford Peaches was, I don't know, maybe a red hat with a white circle and a block R in red.
Right.
They were just so ugly looking, and every team did that. They were just terrible, and there was no logos. And granted, it was during World War II, and people don't have time for that. So I was like, what the heck would their hats and their logos and everything be like? And I always thought about that. And then I got the chance to do it for real when I started working with a company called Team Brown Apparel. I used to do a lot of apparel work for Ebbets Field, and then they got sold, and they don't really care about that stuff anymore. But Team Brown did, and they had the contract to do All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. So I finally got to see, like, if somebody did a T-shirt in 1946, what would it look like?
Yeah.
So I got to pull on my knowledge of old graphic design and typefaces and things like that and try to come up with a different one for each team. So I think I've probably done about 15 or 16 of them now.
Cool.
And Team Brown has them in all different T-shirts, sweatshirts, and everything. They're really cool. Among my favorite things I've done.
I love that series. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, so I went lefty-righty, so it's time for another lefty. For my third starter, I went with Babe Ruth. Babe has been called an American original. He is undoubtedly the game's first great slugger and the most celebrated athlete of his time. He honed his skills at St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys in Baltimore, then came to the big leagues as a pitcher with the Red Sox, where he won 89 games in 6 years while setting the World Series record for consecutive scoreless innings. But the Red Sox recognized Ruth's ability at the plate and began transitioning him to the outfield. In 1918, the Red Sox won their 4th World Series title in 7 seasons, and Ruth was there for 3 of them. He led the American League with 11 home runs, while also going 13-7 on the mound that year. Then in 1919, Ruth set a new single-season record with 29 home runs while recording 113 RBI. He went 9-5 on the mound that year, which was his last year with more than 2 appearances as a pitcher. When I did my episode with Sean Hearn, who's the executive director of the Babe Ruth Birthplace and Museum in Baltimore, he said if Babe Ruth never became a full-time outfielder and an offensive star, and just stayed a pitcher for the remainder of his career, he may not have become Babe Ruth, but he almost certainly still would have been a Hall of Famer just as a pitcher. Ruth's former teammate, Joe Dugan, once said, "To understand him, you have to understand this. He wasn't human." And sports writer Tommy Holmes, who was the winner of the 1979 Baseball Writers Association of America's Career Excellence Award, once said, 20 years ago, I stopped talking about Babe Ruth for the simple reason that I realized that those who had never seen him didn't believe me." Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Babe Ruth.
All right, I'll tell you the story. It has nothing to do with baseball. In 2002, I took a year off, and I traveled around the country with Charles Vassalaro, who's a sports writer out of Baltimore. And we took an exhibit from the Babe Ruth Museum around the country to minor league ballparks, and also spring training in the beginning of the year for Major League Baseball. So we're in Arizona, and we got this thing set up, and we had a little guest book that people could sign and write, "Hey, nice exhibit," or something like that. Mm-hmm. I can't remember what ballpark we were in Arizona, but Charlie and I were both away from the book, and we were talking to fans. And Charlie goes back to the book, and he goes, "Oh my God, what the heck is this?" So I go over there, and I look. Somebody had wrote, "Babe Ruth saved my brother's life." I was like, what the heck is that? So Charlie goes up to the announcing booth in the stadium and had the announcer page whoever wrote this in the book. So this woman comes down and she says, "Yeah, Babe Ruth saved my little brother's life. After World War II, we came over from Russia, and my little brother had a bad heart, and he needed an operation, and poor immigrants were living in Brooklyn. And somehow this man named Babe Ruth found out about it. And he not only paid for her brother to go out to Minnesota to get this operation done, but had the parents go out there too and stay there for however months it took for him to recuperate."
Wow.
It's not in any newspaper. Nobody knows this story except for this lady, because it happened to her brother. I never read it anywhere, but it's true. And that's the type of person that Babe Ruth was. He was a big publicity guy and loved to brag and yell about things that he did. But he also did all these little things on the side, especially for children,
Yes.
because of his upbringing. And it's things like that that really touched me about Ruth. And I think he's my favorite player of all time, just for stories like that. Because, like Dugan said, he's just not human.
Yeah, one of the things that Sean Hearn talked about when he gave us like a private tour of the museum, and then we talked afterwards, and he pointed out when you see a photo of Babe Ruth, there are 2 different smiles. There's his PR smile when Christy Walsh is orchestrating the PR, whether it's a photo opportunity at a hospital or a photo opportunity selling a product or whatever. And then there's the real Babe Ruth smile, and that smile only really comes out when it's a candid photo, and usually when he's with children.
Yeah. I have this great photograph. It's actually hanging in my living room. It's Babe Ruth, and he, after the 1927 season, he went out to the West Coast, I guess for a barnstorming tour probably, but he was in someplace in Washington State, and he visited an orphanage. And there's this picture of him just surrounded by all these kids, and they all have one of his candy bars that came out at the time. They're holding the wrappers and stuff, and they're all beaming, and this guy's in the middle, and it's one of the greatest pictures I've ever seen of him.
Yeah.
Not taken on a baseball field, because he just looks like he's in his element, and just to see the joy on these kids' faces, it's just wonderful. And that's why I have it. When you first walk into my house, it's one of the first things you see.
Yeah. All right, who is your third pitcher?
Sigmund Jokuki. He was a pitcher for the 1944 St. Louis Browns, the only Browns team that won the pennant. He was a left-handed pitcher from Camden, New Jersey. Just a dead-end kid, grew up in the 1920s, got into a lot of trouble. He was just a hellraiser. Ran away and joined the Army and was stationed in Hawaii. Now, this is at the same time Bullet Rogan and the 24th Infantry were playing out in Hawaii. So not only did he play on his Army team at the time, he also played for a semi-pro team called the Honolulu Braves. Jokuki was such a fan favorite because he was such a good pitcher. Fans of the Braves that went to see him play took up a collection to get him out of the Army, buy him a steamship ticket to San Francisco where he could try out for a Pacific Coast League team.
Cool.
Because the fans actually loved the guy that much. So anyway, he goes to San Francisco and he tries out for the San Francisco Missions. He just wasn't good enough. So he kicked around the minor leagues for a few years. Wound up with the Browns, pitched a few games and just got killed. But the Browns were lousy at the time too. So and plus he didn't have much discipline. He was a degenerate alcoholic and liked to go out and have a great time, get into fights and everything like that. There's a great story about him and a teammate in the minor leagues. They went to a wrestling show, and the two guys, they're getting tanked up in the audience, drinking beer. And the two wrestlers that were wrestling weren't putting on a good enough show. And these two guys thought they'd do better. So they jumped in the ring, beat the heck out of the wrestlers, threw them out, and started wrestling themselves. So that's the kind of guy he was. So anyway, he kicked around the minor leagues for a while, and finally they got tired of him and his ways. And played semi-pro, was a wallpaper hanger in Texas, played for a shoe company, semi-pro team for a while. And that's where the St. Louis Browns rediscovered him again. He won an amateur baseball competition with the shoe company team. One of the scouts for the Browns found him. This is 1944. In the middle of World War II, all the good guys are overseas or in the Army. So they're finding anybody they can to fill a roster. So they found Jokuki again, and next thing you know, he's pitching for the Browns, and he's the ace of their staff in 1944. Their big money pitcher. He actually pitched the pennant-clinching game against the Yankees, which was a big deal because, like I said, this guy really loved the nightlife. And what his teammates did, they locked him in his room the night before the big game because they wanted to win the pennant. Yeah. So they locked him in there and made him promise that he wouldn't take a drink the night before. So the guard's outside the door. He didn't leave or anything like that. And sure enough, he's completely sober in the morning. And what does he do? He goes right to a bar to have a drink because he said, I promised I wouldn't do it last night. I didn't promise about this morning. But he wins the game and gets the Browns the pennant. There's a great story. The Browns used to stay in the New Yorker Hotel in New York when they were playing the Yankees. Jokuki's in the bar one evening, and there's this mobster that's in there, some mafia guy, and he's shooting his mouth off and waving a gun around, trying to impress the women. Sig just wants to sit there and have his drink. He just wants to have his scotch and be left alone. This loudmouth keeps going and going and going. So Jokuki gets up, pulls the guy's gun out, beats him with it, unconscious, sits back down and finishes his drink. And that's the kind of guy he was. I love ball players like that.
You're putting together a real interesting clubhouse over there.
Yeah. We might have a problem on that. We're definitely going to need a chaperone. Like I said, he was the Browns' best pitcher at the time. 1945, the next year, he starts off pretty good, but he's also getting into a lot of trouble. Finally, he runs into it with the Browns manager, Sewell. Sewell just couldn't take it anymore, kicked him off the team, and that was the end of his career.
Dang. All right, back to a right-handed pitcher for my next spot in the rotation. Though he didn't invent the pitch, Eddie Ciecott was perhaps the first major league pitcher to master the knuckleball. He threw the pitch so well that Knuckles became his nickname. He led the major leagues with 11.9 WAR in 1917, leading the White Sox to a World Series championship against the New York Giants. Ciecott once estimated that 75% of the pitches he threw were knuckleballs. The rest of the time, the right-hander relied on a fadeaway, slider, screwball, spitter, emery ball, shine ball, and a pitch he called the sailor, which was a rising fastball that would, quote, sail much in the same manner of a flat stone thrown by a small boy. Perhaps no pitcher in the world has such a varied assortment of wares in his repertoire as Ciecott, the Sporting News observed in 1918. But the most famous pitch that Ciecott ever threw was the one that nailed Cincinnati Reds leadoff man Maury Rath squarely in the back to lead off the 1919 World Series, a pitch that signaled to the gamblers that the fix was on. After confessing to his role in the Black Sox scandal 1 year later, Ciecott was banned from the game for life, a punishment that perhaps denied the 209-game winner a spot in the Hall of Fame. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Eddie Ciecott.
I love the Black Sox players and that whole story. I was more fascinated by what happened to him afterwards.
Yes.
You know, 'cause they usually don't say what happens and it's banned from baseball, and that's it. All those guys went on to have long baseball careers after that. Eddie Ciecott and a couple of the other guys from the team, they actually got a little barnstorming club together, and they were called the ex-Major League Stars. Toured Minnesota, upper Midwest, until infighting and literal fighting ended the team. And Ciecott lost a couple of teeth in a fist fight with Swede Risberg. So there's that. And after that, Ciecott went back to Michigan. He played for a Ford Motor Company team and a couple other things. When I was researching him, when I did my series on the Black Sox, when I was going through newspaper archives online, I got a bunch of kickbacks for Eddie Ciecott from a Polish language newspaper in Detroit. And I was like, well, my family's Polish, so I automatically got interested. I'm like, is Eddie Ciecott Polish? He's not. But he played for a couple of years for the Polish newspaper in Detroit for their baseball team. He was their ringer. I just like the stories of what happened to these players afterwards. But the fact that those guys had that team called ex-Major League Stars just must have really pissed Landis off to no end.
Absolutely.
It was kind of just like sticking it in his eye.
Tell us a little bit about the After the Black Sox set that you created, which is something I absolutely love.
Thanks. I wanted to write a full-length story on each of the players. There's a lot of great research that's done by Sabres Black Sox committee. Those guys are top-notch researchers.
Yeah.
So I was kind of not thinking I was going to find much that was original research on my end. But I actually did when it came down to Joe Jackson, interestingly enough. I found a bunch of games that he played in New Jersey and Pennsylvania that hadn't been documented before, which I thought was pretty cool. That's one of my researching crowns that I like, especially that they took place in New Jersey, where I'm from, too. So I kind of had that connection. But yeah, I did a different booklet on each of the 8 guys that got banned and tried to tell their life story after what happened to them. We were talking about uniforms before. That was one of my favorite parts, was trying to figure out what uniforms that those guys had, because they're really undocumented.
Yes.
You have to really dig deep to figure out what they looked like. But the illustration that I did of Eddie Ciecott has him wearing that ex-Major League Stars jersey, which is really cool looking.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, and then who is your 4th pitcher?
Cy Malice. This is a guy that played just one game for Phillies, I believe. But he was a big semi-pro pitcher around the Philadelphia area where he was from. And career never really went anywhere. He was just a good semi-pro sandlot guy. He served in the Navy during World War II and broke his back and his neck in the war. When he was recuperating in the hospital, he got addicted to morphine, which they're using to treat this tremendous pain that he had. So they discharge him from the service, and he's got this terrible drug habit, which he successfully beat. He used that experience to be one of the founders of Narcotics Anonymous, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, it was a guy who played one game for the Phillies, and sure enough, he did something really good with the terrible lot that he was given in life.
Well, like we said earlier, baseball history is American history, and you'd never think that this program that thousands of people have gone through was started by a baseball player who had an injury.
Yeah.
All right, to round out my staff, I went back to a left-hander, Lefty Grove. Grove pitched 17 seasons in the big leagues, 9 of them with the Philadelphia Athletics and 8 with the Red Sox. He broke in with Connie Mack's Athletics in 1925 and led the American League in strikeouts in his rookie year. He would go on to lead the American League in strikeouts in each of his first 7 seasons. He had the lowest ERA in the American League in 9 of his 17 seasons, and in 7 of those seasons, he was a 20-game winner, not counting 1931, when he went 31-4. During a 6-season stretch from 1928 through 1933, he went 152-41, and in 2 of those seasons, 1930 and 31, he won the pitching Triple Crown, leading the league in wins, ERA, and strikeouts. His 9 ERA titles are the most of any pitcher in history. Grove went 300 and 141 for his career, a .680 winning percentage, which is the highest among all 24 members of the 300-win club. And he is also one of only 3 pitchers, along with Warren Spahn and Early Wynn, to have joined the 300-win club between 1924 and 1982. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Lefty Grove.
Yeah, to me, the most interesting part about Grove was what happened to him before he went to the major leagues. He played for the minor league Baltimore Orioles, which was in the International League at the time, which was the equivalent of AAA today. That team is the team that Babe Ruth started off with. Grove's manager was Jack Dunn, who was Babe Ruth's first manager with the Orioles. Dunn originally sold Babe Ruth because the Federal League put a team in Baltimore and it put the Orioles out of business. He had to leave town. But before that, he had to sell off all his stars, Ruth included. And he was always bitter about that they made him sell his best players. When Grove went up to the Orioles, I believe he started in 1920, I think. He was from a small town in the hills of Maryland, and Jack Dunn's son was a scout, found him playing for a small minor league team, and the Orioles gave that team a new outfield fence for Grove's contract. Grove pitched from 1920 to, 1925 with the Orioles, and, I mean, his winning streak is just incredible. He was also really wild, but he would also lead the International League in strikeouts a couple of those seasons. Just a tremendous pitcher. And through Grove, I learned about the early 1920s Orioles, and they won 6 pennants in a row in the International League. It got to the point where the rest of the owners made the Orioles break up their team and sell their stars off. That's why Grove went up to the Athletics.
And so did Max Camera Eye Bishop,
Yep.
Who I think he's one of the top on-base percentage players in baseball history.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they had some real superstar players.
And Joe Boley, too, who was the Orioles shortstop. When he played for the Orioles, he was regarded as the best shortstop in or out of the major leagues at the time. He was that good. But a lot of these players didn't want to go to the major leagues because Dunn ran his team like a major league team. He gave them major league salaries. Like when they would play in Jersey City or Newark, he had all the players stay in Manhattan hotels, not lousy Jersey City hotels, you know. The team traveled around in Pierce Arrow automobiles, you know. He really treated them like major leaguers.
And they were winning.
Oh, yeah.
So you're getting paid, you're winning, you're traveling in luxury. Like, going to the major leagues is not an upgrade.
Yeah. And, you know, Connie Mack really made out because he got Bishop, he got Boley, of course, Grove, and he got George Earnshaw.
Right.
So,
yeah. All right, and then who is your final pitcher?
That's going to be Tom Lefty Glover. People who follow my work for a while know how much I like this guy. When I was in art school in Baltimore in 1988, I was going around the neighborhood that I lived in, and people used to just sell stuff on their stoops on Saturdays, little tiny flea markets, you know. I walked by this one, and there was a framed black and white picture of a black ball player. His uniform said Elite Giants, which I knew was the Negro League team that played in Baltimore in the 30s and 40s. So I think it was 50 cents or something like that. So I bought it. I didn't know who it was. I got it home, took the frame off, and it said Lefty Glover on the back. And I was like, oh, who the heck is this guy? Peterson's book, Only the Ball Was White, had a roster in the back of everybody that played in the Negro Leagues that he could find at the time when he wrote this in the 70s, which was a huge undertaking.
Absolutely.
And sure enough, there was Glover, showed the teams that he played with. So just over the years, I always wanted to find out who the heck this guy was. Because, I mean, he wasn't a star or anything like that. But he was one of the starters for Baltimore off and on in the 1930s and 40s. So when I met Leon Day, and Leon Day introduced me to a lot of the players, a lot of his friends that were Negro League players in 30s and 40s, I always made it a point to ask if they knew Tom Glover. Of course, everybody did. And I would get little tiny pieces of information about him. And I was never able to find out where he was from, where he died, or anything about him, just his playing time. And then over the years, I would just pick up little things. From one of the old ball players, thought that he was from Alabama. Another guy thought he was from Mississippi. So I wrote all those things down. I had this file that I carried with me for 20-something years. But I never had enough to do a story on this guy. And it was always killing me, you know. So finally, you had Ancestry.com, which opened up a lot of doors, except for Tom Glover. So what happened was I was in California for Christmas at my in-laws. And I had my Tom Glover file with me. It was the day after Christmas, I think, and I was sitting with my wife on the couch and just paging through it. And I thought, what if that's not his real name? So I took his birthday and the name of his wife, I think, and I wound up finding, I think it was a passport application, or maybe it was an immigration thing when he was traveling from Cuba or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't his name. He had an entirely different name. And I was like, that's what it was.
Uh-huh.
And sure enough, then I was able to backtrack and get where he was from. He began the early part of his career playing under his real name, and
Which was?
Moss. So his name was Thomas Glover Moss. And I think Glover was the name of his father, I think, but nobody really can't say for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I was able to finally solve this mystery of who this guy was. And it was sad because everything that I found about him kind of disappeared after 1945. It turns out he had tuberculosis, and he died in a tuberculosis hospital outside of Baltimore. With his real name, I was able to get his death certificate from Maryland and put the last piece together.
Yeah. So it's a bittersweet ending, but how great does that feel to like close that loop?
I'll never forget sitting on the couch and like, I found him! And my wife's like, yeah!
Yeah, because after 20 years of looking for stuff, I'm sure she was just as anxious as you were to find out who is this guy?
Yeah. And I, whenever I got bored, I would take the Lefty Glover folder out and sit there and try to find it. And it was neat. After I published the story, a guy contacted me from Birmingham who has a sports antique store. I have an 8x10 publicity shot that somebody walked in with of Lefty Glover, an original Type 1 photograph.
Cool.
And he just gave it to me.
Awesome.
I was like, this guy was nice enough, and he's like, you did all the research on this. I think you should have this.
Cool.
It's one of my prized possessions now.
All right, so for my catcher, I went with Roy Campanella. Campanella began playing professional baseball at the age of 15 and went on to star for the Baltimore Elite Giants of the Negro National League. And earlier you mentioned that name as well, the Elite Giants. When did you find out that that's how it was pronounced and it's not pronounced elite? Who did you first hear that from?
People I talked to in Baltimore, like the old African-American people, that if I figured out somebody was old enough to have been around back then in the 30s or 40s, I'd be like, did you ever see any of these teams, see Eli Giants or the Black Sox before? Did you ever see them play? And a lot of people, of course, said, yeah. But through them, I've learned that it was pronounced Elite.
Do you know why it was pronounced that way?
I think it just sounds cool.
Yeah, okay. That's always been kind of my guess.
Yeah, I know the team started off in Nashville originally, and then they moved to Washington, D.C., Columbus, Detroit for a little bit, Cleveland at one point, so and then before they finally wound up in Baltimore. So whatever it is, it started off in Nashville.
Yeah. Campanella spent 8 years in the Negro Leagues before the Dodgers signed him to a contract in 1946 after Jackie Robinson had broken the color barrier in organized baseball. In 1948, Campanella began the season in the American Association with St. Paul, hitting 11 home runs in his first 24 games. By mid-season, he was the Dodgers' regular catcher. In his first full season with the Dodgers in 1949, Campanella hit 22 home runs and drove in 82 runs en route to the first of 8 straight All-Star Game selections. In 1951, Campanella won the National League Most Valuable Player Award while hitting .325 with 33 home runs and 108 runs batted in. He won his second MVP in 1953 while driving in a record 142 runs as a catcher, and then grabbed his third MVP award in 1955, leading the Dodgers to their first World Series title. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Roy Campanella.
Gosh, where do you start with somebody like him? Well, I'll say this. There was a lot of talk about renaming the MVP award after Josh Gibson. And I just thought that was a terrible idea. Not that Josh Gibson wasn't a great player, and he probably would have won at least one MVP award had he played in the white major leagues. But I always said, if you want to change the name it after Roy Campanella. I mean, that guy won a bunch of them.
Yeah.
He played the early part of his career and was just as good in the Negro Leagues as he was in the major leagues. That's the guy you should name the MVP award after if you want to change the name. That's the thing that always got me about Campanella was, he played in the Negro Leagues, I guess, starting when he was 15, I think. And then he was playing like full games when he was 16. I mean, that's ridiculous. So he had an entire career before he
became a 3-time MVP award winner in the white major leagues.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So it's like that guy, it's like 2 players back to back. Who knows how much longer he would have played had he not been injured in 1957.
Yeah. Okay, and then who is your catcher?
I picked a guy by the name of Pythias Roos. I live in Kentucky, and I'm slowly working on a book of baseball history told through people that played in Kentucky or were from Kentucky. And there's a lot of Negro League players that were from Kentucky, but there's one that I hadn't heard of before, and his name was Pythias Roos. And he was from a town about an hour south of where I live. There's a guy by the name of Gary Cieradkowski, who's a historian in Cynthiana, where Roos is from. And he wrote a bunch of pieces on this guy. And when I read it, I'm like, how the heck did I never hear about this guy? He played for the Chicago American Giants in the 1920s. He was a star college athlete to start off with, and then joined the Chicago American Giants when they were the top team in the 1920s. And he was their catcher and shortstop. He kind of went back and forth between the two positions. But more importantly, he was their leadoff guy. And this is a guy that batted 350, 360, 369, I think in 3 or 4 seasons. And he was one of the better hitters in the Negro Leagues at the time. What happened was he was also working as a mailman. He was coaching college football. I believe he was even coaching high school baseball. I mean, the guy just wore himself completely out, and he wound up dying of pneumonia.
Oh, man.
I think he was only like 25 years old or 26 years old, but he had 4 great seasons in the Negro Leagues with the Chicago American Giants. And I mean, who knows what would have happened afterwards. Plus, the guy was such an athlete, he was able to play catcher and shortstop. I mean, those are 2 real specialized positions. The part of the story that really got me was one of his teammates on the Chicago American Giants was talking to a reporter and said that the poor guy just worked himself to death.
Yeah. You've made it a little game at the past couple Sabre conventions to give away a new card each day to people who come find you, and on one of the days from the 2024 convention, you gave away a Pythias Rus card. How did that idea come about, and what's your favorite part of that ritual of making people come find you to give them your work?
I'm a terrible introvert, and I have a hard time meeting people. And so that's one of the ways I get around that. I have a hard time walking up to somebody and introducing myself. So I thought that would be a neat way to meet other baseball historians. and it works.
Yeah.
I've made a lot of friends through that.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
And plus, if I can introduce somebody to a new player, that's kind of cool too.
Absolutely. For my first baseman, I went with Lou Gehrig. Gehrig is chiefly known for playing 2,130 consecutive games for the Yankees, a magnificent streak long thought to have been unbreakable until Cal Ripken Jr. came along. One of the most magnificent hitters and run producers in history, his RBI totals would be even greater had he not batted behind Babe Ruth for the first 12 years of his career. From 1923 through 1934, Babe Ruth batted third in the Yankees lineup, and Gehrig batted fourth, which is why they each wore the uniform numbers that they did. During that span, Babe hit 511 home runs, meaning that Lou Gehrig came to the plate 511 times immediately after Babe Ruth had cleared the bases. In those 12 years, Lou still managed to drive in 1,450 runs, an average of more than 120 per season. In 1927, when Babe Ruth hit a record-setting 60 home runs, Lou still drove in 173 runs. Babe Ruth led the league with 49 home runs in 1930, and Lou had another season with 173 RBIs. And Babe led all of Major League Baseball in 1931 with 46 home runs, and Lou had 185 RBI that year, which is the second most in a single season in MLB history, trailing only Hack Wilson's 191 in 1930. Oh, and Lou's 2 years with 173 RBI, those are each tied for the 5th most in a single season in MLB history. Gehrig scored more than 100 runs and recorded at least 100 runs batted in for 13 straight seasons in a career that featured just 14 seasons as a regular player. He led the American League in runs 4 times, in home runs 3 times, in RBI 5 times, on base percentage 5 times, and in batting average once. His 1934 Triple Crown season was remarkable. He hit 363, he knocked in 49 home runs, and he drove in 166. Since 1900, there have been 13 different players who have had a single season with at least 200 hits and at least 100 walks. Of those, only 5 have done it multiple times. Todd Helton and Stan Musial each did it twice, Babe Ruth did it 3 times, Wade Boggs did it 4 times, Lou Gehrig did it 7 times. During his 17 seasons, the Yankees won 7 pennants and 6 World Series. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Lou Gehrig.
Yeah, he was one of those players I didn't think was very interesting because, he never got into trouble. He just showed up and beat the hell out of the ball every time.
Yeah.
But I grew up in New Jersey, and there were always these stories that Lou Gehrig played semi-pro baseball when he was in college before he went to the Yankees. And, everybody hears stories like that. But it turns out that was actually true. He played, I believe it was the 1922 season, with a team in Morristown, New Jersey, under the assumed name of Lou Long. Lou Gehrig was at Columbia University at the time, and he had gotten in trouble the year before because the New York Giants manager, John McGraw, convinced him to play minor league baseball in Hartford in the Eastern League under an assumed name. Nobody will ever find out. Well, of course, everybody did because Gehrig was already semi-famous, especially in the metropolitan area because he was a big football star in high school. When he signed to go to Columbia, that was a huge deal at the time.
Yeah.
So anyway, he got into a lot of trouble for being paid to play baseball. So what happened was Columbia's coach actually got the other Ivy League baseball managers for all the other colleges to sign a waiver and say, all right, if he stays out this year, next year we'll give him his eligibility back. Mm-hmm. So he had to sit out the baseball and football season in his freshman year. So that's the way the story goes. And Gehrig was such a straight arrow. He did do that, and he never broke the law again. Well, next year, what does he do? He winds up in New Jersey getting paid to play baseball again. But the thing was, unlike when he was playing in Hartford, Connecticut, where everybody ratted him out, in New Jersey, everybody kept their mouth shut, and he never got caught. So it was kind of neat going back and finding that story. And I wound up meeting an amateur historian from Morristown, and he was also tracking down the story too. And he told me that there was a photograph of this team, and it used to hang in a bar in Morristown. So of course I took a trip there, and the bar's not there anymore, and nobody knows what happened to it. Well, this guy actually tracked down the family of the bar's owner and found the photograph.
Wow.
And now I actually have a copy of it hanging on my wall now.
Cool.
So there's actually photographic proof that he played in Morristown. And he's got his hat pulled down really low over his eyes. But I thought that was neat that nobody ratted him out in Jersey.
Yeah, very New Jersey story. If you don't mind, I'd also love for you to really quickly tell the story about Hank Greenberg being scouted by the Yankees in 1929, because I love that story, and I almost picked him for my first baseman, but I just couldn't pick somebody over Lou Gehrig.
Yeah, so Hank Greenberg grew up in the Bronx, and the Yankees were his favorite team. When he was starting out in baseball, he played semi-pro baseball for a team called the Bay Parkways. And back then, in the 20s and 30s, New York had all these great semi-pro teams, and a lot of them were college players, ex-major league players, minor league players that didn't want to play pro ball anymore. They had real jobs, maybe with the city, or a couple of guys were stockbrokers and things like that, and they made more money doing that than they would play professional baseball. So they'd play on weekends, make a couple $100. So there was all these great teams, and the Bay Parkways was one of them. Greenberg wound up playing for them when he was in high school. Problem was he wasn't getting paid, and he didn't understand why. Everybody else was getting money after a game, and he's playing well. He's hitting above 400 in the games that they have box scores from. So obviously he's doing a great job, but the coach isn't giving him any money after games. So finally he got over his shyness and asked the coach, and I'm like, why ain't I getting paid? Oh, I thought you wanted to go to college and you didn't want to lose your eligibility. He says, I don't care about college. I want to get paid. This poor kid from the Bronx. So then he got a regular handout after that. But the Yankees wound up scouting him, and they wanted him to be the first baseman for the Yankees. Well, who's playing first base for the Yankees? Lou Gehrig. Paul Krischel, who was the big scout for the Yankees, the super scout, Paul Krischel, he took Greenberg to a Yankees game, and they're sitting there, and Krischel points over to first base. He says, yeah, he's not going to be there that much longer. Now, this is like 1931 or something like that.
I think it's 1929.
1929, yeah.
So, yeah, this is 2 years removed from Murderer's Row.
Yeah.
Gehrig was a rookie in 23, so it's not like he wasn't 37 years old.
Yeah. So Greenberg was smart enough to know that he's not going to replace Gehrig. He's not a washout. He's not going to retire anytime soon. The Yankees sure as hell weren't going to trade him.
Yeah, he hasn't missed a game in 5 years.
Yeah, and he wouldn't for another how many? Yeah, so he declined to sign with the Yankees, and that's how he wound up with Detroit.
Yeah, that's so funny. All right, who is your first baseman?
I got a guy by the name of Rupert Mills. He was a guy from Newark, New Jersey. I believe he was the first four-letter athlete in Notre Dame history. Baseball was his big love. When he graduated, there happened to be a third major league at the time called the Federal League that was competing with the American and National League. So he signed with the Newark team, which is called the Peppers. He had a 2-year contract to play 1915 and 1916. Well, the Federal League folded after the 1915 season, and he still had a contract to be paid for 1916. He didn't really want to pursue Major League Baseball. He got a couple offers to join the American League or National League teams, but he was a business major, so he had another career he wanted to start. But he had this contract, so there was no team. There was no playing team. The team was still around. They were trying to wrap up their finances. So he refused to take a budget payout or something like that. And he's like, no, I want my money. Give me my money. The owner of the Newark team said, all right, fine. Show up every day. So that's what he did. During the 1916 season, he showed up every day at this abandoned ballpark in Harrison, New Jersey. He'd show up at 10 o'clock and stay until 6. And he would sit there and throw the ball around and hit balls by himself. Sometimes people would come and pitch for him. Uh-huh. But yeah, he had to be there. And I think that went on for like 2 months. And then finally, all right, forget about it. Here's a payout.
Yeah.
And everybody agreed on it. But I thought that was great. For half a season, he was a one-man ball team.
I love that story.
But there's all these great articles of newspaper men traveling to this abandoned stadium and interviewing him.
How'd you play today, Roop? Yeah, pretty good.
Yeah.
I think I made my money's worth today. All right, my second baseman, I went with Jackie Robinson. Robinson played for the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro Leagues until Brooklyn Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey tabbed him as the player who would integrate the white major leagues. Rickey wanted Robinson not only for his talent and style of play, but also because of his demeanor. He knew Robinson would have to endure mental and physical abuse, and Rickey wanted him to handle it without fighting back. Robinson endured teammates and crowds who opposed his presence and threats to himself and his family with honor and grace. At the end of his first season, Robinson was named the winner of the inaugural Baseball Writers Association of America's Rookie of the Year award. He was named National League MVP just 2 years later in 1949 when he led the league in hitting with a .342 average and 37 steals, while also notching a career-high 124 runs batted in. The Dodgers won 6 pennants in Robinson's 10 seasons and captured the 1955 World Series title. Can you tell us about Jackie Robinson's experience in the military, both at Camp Breckenridge and at Fort Hood?
Yeah, that's one of the neat stories I found when I was working on my Kentucky book originally. After he was court-martialed in the Army for refusing to go to the back of the bus, it was a desegregated military bus, but the driver told him to sit in the back of the bus. Now, he was a lieutenant at the time, so he's an officer even, and they still made him, or insisted that he did. He refused, and the MPs arrested him. They court-martialed him, even though nobody really wanted to do it because it was stupid. Mm-hmm. It was just a stupid thing. And Robinson, don't forget, at the time, he was a famous college athlete, so he had already been in a lot of newspapers coast to coast. People knew his name. And here is the stupid Army trying to court-martial on us. I think he tried to get him on insubordination or talking back to an MP or something, which he swore he never did. Mm-hmm. The court-martial went nowhere, and he was found innocent, no charges. But at the time that it took to come to that finding, his unit had shipped out overseas. So he was left without a regiment. In the meantime, he had a busted-up ankle from playing football. Turns out the Army was like, well, you know what? We don't really need you that bad. So they wanted to discharge him because he wasn't fit for overseas duty. His unit was already gone. But they didn't know what to do with him until the Glacial Army paperwork would go through. Mm-hmm. So they shipped him out to a place called Camp Breckenridge in southern Kentucky. And that was basically like a clearinghouse for troops that were going overseas. Well, by this time, it's 1944, early 1945, and most of the troops are already shipped out and fighting in Europe and the Pacific. So it was pretty much an empty base at the time. They were shutting it down. So Robinson was the athletic director there. And there really wasn't much of a team or anything like that because people were getting shifted around. But he's hanging out at the baseball field one day, and there's a black soldier, and he's on the mound, and he's just whipping out these major league curveballs. So he winds up striking up a conversation with him. And it turns out this guy pitched for the Kansas City Monarchs before the war. And this pitcher asked him, Jackie, what are you going to do after you get out of the Army? He says, I don't know. You know, he had no openings, no job offers or anything like that. Didn't really know what he wanted to do. I think he wanted to be maybe a gym teacher or something like that, but he had no solid plans. So this guy gave him the contact information for the owners of the Monarchs. He said, man, you really should play for them. You got this great name. They're definitely going to sign you. Mm-hmm. Well, baseball wasn't Robinson's best sport. Football was. So he never really thought about playing professional baseball. And he had actually played in a couple of games with black teams out on the West Coast and around Los Angeles. And he didn't like the way that these teams were run because I think they stiffed him for his pay or something like that. So he had a really negative outlook on that whole thing. Mm-hmm. But this pitcher for the Monarchs talked the team up really well. He's a first-class outfit. And so anyway, Robinson winds up, after he gets his discharge, contacts the Monarchs. And next thing you know, he's playing in the major leagues. But it's just funny, like what baseball history would be like if he didn't meet this guy. You know, probably would have been Jack Robinson, really good athletic coach for some high school team in Los Angeles or something like that. Or maybe he would have played semi-pro football, mm-hmm. or maybe he would have integrated the NFL at the time. I don't know. But baseball history sure would have been different. You know, if they would have picked Satchel Paige to integrate the major leagues instead of Jackie Robinson. I mean, everything would have been different.
Yeah, American history, not just baseball history.
Absolutely.
I mean, he was the start of the civil rights fight. Okay, then who is your second baseman?
Sammy T. Hughes. He was a second baseman for the Baltimore Elite Giants. When I was living in Baltimore, when I was in art school, I would talk to old fans of the team and then also the old players, like, who was the best first baseman you saw? But when it came to second base, everybody said Sammy T. Hughes. And everybody talk about him and they get just a smile because you can't say his name without getting a smile on your face. So that started me looking into his career. And he's probably the one Negro League second baseman that should be in the Hall of Fame, but for some reason just kind of fell through the cracks. I think he was up 1 or 2 times for a Negro League committee in the Hall of Fame, just never got enough votes. I like to say it's because the Baltimore Elite Giants aren't one of those sexy teams like the Homestead Grays or the Kansas City Monarchs. Not many people write about the Elite Giants. Campanella always said that was one of the best second basemen he ever saw. Yeah, it's just a shame. And when I wrote that piece on Sammy Hughes, I was hoping somebody might get a hold of it and tell the Hall of Fame to put him back on the ballot eventually.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
Still might happen. For my shortstop, I went with Hannes Wagner. And notice how I'm pronouncing that first name as Hannes, not Honus. That's because it's short for Johannes, which is German, which is also why his nickname was the Flying Dutchman. Wagner played 21 seasons, primarily with his hometown team, the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he was the total package. He hit for average and for power, and he could change the dynamics of a game on the base paths and in the field. Wagner hit 300 or better for 15 straight seasons from 1899 to 1913. In that span, Wagner won 8 National League batting titles, led the National League in doubles 7 times, in stolen bases 5 times, and in runs batted in 4 times. He paced the league in slugging percentage 6 times and on-base percentage 4 times. Hall of Fame manager John McGraw called Wagner the nearest thing to a perfect player no matter where his manager chose to play him, and he played all over the field. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Hannes Wagner.
Yeah, he was another guy that has a Jersey connection that I remember when I was a kid. I remember friends of my grandfather saying that, oh yeah, Hannes Wagner used to play in Patterson, next city over from where I was born. I just thought that was really cool. And I never read about that. I knew he was with the Pittsburgh Pirates. That one was a little easier to research because there's a lot of books on Wagner. I believe in Patterson is where he got the name Hannes. But it was spelled by the sports writers Hannis.
Right, yeah.
When he went to Louisville, they changed it to Honus. Wagner was playing with Patterson, and he was the third baseman, and he was awful, but he was a hell of a hitter. Patterson wound up selling him to the Louisville Colonels, which was a major league team at the time in the National League, and they wisely switched him over from shortstop. So all the errors dried up, and his bat was great, and he redefined the way you play shortstop. But yeah, he started off in New Jersey, his first professional team.
All right, who is your shortstop?
Okay, this is a guy nobody knows about. His name was Lucky Jack Riley. That's not his real name. I love American history, or just world history. I love the history of the U.S. Navy and China in the 1920s. If you ever saw the old Steve McQueen movie, The Sand Pebbles, I was always riveted by that movie. One of my side things is I love researching China at that time period. A lot of gangsters. It was an open city. It was a crazy place. I would have loved to have gone there at the time. There was also baseball, just like anywhere else in the world. The Marines had a team, the Navy had a team, and they played in Shanghai in the Shanghai City League. And there was also one team that was made up of civilians. Now, the guy that started that team was a dude by the name of Lucky Jack Riley. Riley was a mysterious underworld figure, and he cornered the gambling and slot machines in Shanghai, China. That's why they called him Lucky Jack. Nobody knew where he came from, what his real name was. But to this day, you can still find tokens for slot machines that have his initials on the back. Anyway, he was a famous underground figure, but he was also a big baseball player. He was a pitcher and then later transitioned to shortstop. And as he got older, he would just play any position they would stick him in. But in between his gangsterisms, he would make sure he showed up every Saturday morning and played baseball with the Shanghai team. At the same time I was looking at that story, I read another story about a baseball player that played in an outlaw league in Arizona, in the Copper League. That's the league in the 1920s that a lot of Black Sox players played in.
Right.
So there was a lot of blacklisted players that played there. Well, one of the guys who was playing for Phoenix at the time, he got arrested for being a fugitive for the law during the season. He was batting 3-something. He was one of the better players at the time, playing under the name of Roy Counts. He was an outfielder. What happened was he was a fugitive from a jail in Oklahoma City back in the early 20s. He was serving time, but he was also a great ball player. So the prison had a baseball team, and they would let the team go unaccompanied overnight to play town teams in Oklahoma in the countryside. And all the players would just get back on the train and show up at the jail the next day. A lot of times they would spend overnight in a hotel, you know. Can you imagine that today?
No.
So anyway, Roy Counts was on this team and he escaped. He just walked away one day. Instead of catching a train back to prison, him and another ball player walked away. And I was like, who is this other ball player? Digging around, sure enough, all of a sudden, it's Lucky Jack Riley. Nobody had ever put those two things together. Both of those guys are researched by independent people. And all of a sudden, they just two of my favorite things in history, blacklisted, banned, outlaw players, and 1920 Shanghai, China. I mean, who would have figured that those two things would have went together? But Lucky Jack Riley, his luck eventually ran out. They figured out that he was this guy that escaped from prison in Oklahoma, and they wound up catching him. And a U.S. Marshal caught him in Shanghai. But the odd thing is, the guy that was the marshal was a marshal under a false name, and he was a fugitive from the law. He just showed up in Shanghai and said he was a U.S. Marshal. Everybody believed him. But he actually tracked down Jack Riley and had him arrested. And the two of them got shipped back to America on the same ship under irons.
That's so funny. Okay, so for my third baseman, I went with Minnie Minoso. Hall of Famer Orlando Cepeda wrote in his autobiography, Minnie Minoso is to Latin ball players what Jackie Robinson is to black ball players. Minnie is the one who made it possible for all of us Latins. He was the first Latin player to become a superstar. And today, Latin American ball players make up almost 1/3 of all big leaguers. Minoso quickly established himself as a star with Negro League teams like the New York Cubans, but as a black-skinned Latin American, was denied the chance to play in the American League or the National League until Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947. Minoso signed with the Indians just before the 1948 season, making his debut on April 19, 1949 to become the first acknowledged dark-skinned Latin player in American League or National League history. Between 1951 and 1957, Minoso led the league in triples 3 times, in stolen bases 3 times, he scored 100 or more runs 4 times, and recorded at least 100 runs batted in 3 times. In those 7 years, he was named to 5 All-Star teams, finished in the top 10 of the AL MVP voting 4 times, and won a Gold Glove Award for his play in the outfield in 1957, which was the first year the Gold Glove Awards were presented. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Minnie Minoso.
One of the neat things I learned about him was not something you read in a straight biography on him, but other players talking about him in their biographies. The dude was a fashion plate.
Yeah.
He just had the sharpest outfits in the major leagues, they said. That guy had style, too. Supposedly, he bought a brand new Cadillac with his first major league paycheck, top-of-the-line Cadillac, and then had a sign painted on the side with his name and the outline of him as a ball player,
Cool.
as a silhouette. I just thought that was great. See him tearing around Chicago or Cleveland, driving around with that thing, showing up at spring training. Yeah, all the ball players all said they had just the best fashion sense in the major leagues. I just thought that was a neat little thing.
Yeah. And who did you pick for your third baseman?
Guy by the name of Eddie Kazak. He was an up-and-coming minor league ball player in the St. Louis Cardinals chain before World War II. And World War II happens, and like everybody, he gets drafted and winds up in the Army. He's serving in Europe. I believe it was in France. He was in a town that was destroyed by artillery fire, and he's going house to house fighting the Germans. And an artillery shell landed on the house he was in, and he gets buried underneath the rubble. Luckily, they found him, but he had busted up his leg and his arm really bad. They had to reconstruct it with plastic surgery, which was pretty experimental at the time. Saved both limbs, but doctor said he'd never play baseball again. Well, just through sheer determination, the guy goes to minor league. He's playing in Omaha after the war in 1947, I think. Had a great season. The Cardinals picked him up, and he was their starting third baseman for 3 or 4 seasons until injuries finally took a toll on him. But he was a great inspiration, especially for the guys coming home injured after the war. If he didn't sustain those injuries, he probably would have had a really good career after the war. It's too bad.
You're picking a lot of players who have been told they're never going to play again. So I don't know how long your team is going to last, but they're going to be great for maybe a game.
Yeah, I love inspirational stories like that.
For my left fielder, I had no choice but to go with Shoeless Joe Jackson. Joe is widely hailed as the greatest natural hitter in the history of the game. Just ask Ty Cobb, who was Joe's greatest rival during his playing career. Or ask Babe Ruth, who said he modeled his own swing after Joe's. Joe hit sharp line drives to all corners of the ballpark and was fast enough to lead the American League in triples 3 times. He never won a batting title, but his average of .408 in 1911 still stands as a Cleveland team record and a Major League rookie record. People say that Joe's first 3 full seasons in baseball may be the best 3-year offensive run in history. From 1911 through 1913, he led the major leagues with 656 hits. He slashed a batting average of .393, a .462 on-base percentage, and a .574 slugging percentage with a 192 OPS plus. He averaged 219 hits, 43 doubles, 21 triples, and 6 home runs. He also averaged 119 runs, 81 runs batted in, 34 steals, and 320 total bases per season. And this is the dead ball era. During the 1915 season, Cleveland traded him to the Chicago White Sox, where Joe would switch from playing right field, where his glove got the nickname "the place where triples go to die," to playing left field, and lead the White Sox to the 1917 World Series title over the New York Giants. Unfortunately, Joe's career ended abruptly and prematurely because of his involvement in the infamous Black Sox scandal of the 1919 World Series. He was banned from the game following the 1920 season, which was his age 32 season. 1920 was the first year of the live ball era, and Joe had one of the best years of his career. He had a career high in home runs and RBI, driving in 121 runs on 218 hits, the fourth time in his 9 full seasons that he had 200 or more hits. He led the league with 20 triples, and he batted .382, the third highest batting average of his career. Who knows what the 1920s would have looked like if Joe was allowed to continue playing in the majors, but based on his career trajectory and the careers of his contemporaries like Ty Cobb, Tris Speaker, and Roger Hornsby, their production skyrocketed during the live ball era compared to their dead ball stats, especially when it came to their batting averages and runs batted in. So if Joe's career would have been allowed to play out naturally, and had he played to the age that the contemporaries of his talent level played till, he would have easily been a 3,000 hit club member, but hey, maybe I'm a little biased. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Shoeless Joe Jackson.
My favorite thing about Joe Jackson is that Babe Ruth always said that he learned his swing by copying Joe Jackson. I thought that was a neat little thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, the history of baseball in the 1920s would have been totally different had he played. I don't know how many more years he would have had in, but probably at least 5.
At least. I mean, he had just turned 33 when he was banned from baseball. Today, that's an old age, but back then, I mean, Ty Cobb played till he was in his 40s.
Yeah.
And Rogers, like the guys I mentioned, Hornsby, Tris Speaker, like if you were at that level, you played till you were in your 40s.
Yeah.
Minimum 7 seasons of like legitimately good ball still.
Yep.
And probably 2 or 3 more after that.
And he showed it because, when I was doing the Black Sox series, Joe Jackson, he was still a big drawing card after the Black Sox. So he played around New York and New Jersey for about a year after he was banned. And then he went down south and he played for many years there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he was a big draw there.
Yeah,
So-
the teams that he played for in Waycross, Georgia, in 1924 and 25 won the leagues both seasons with him as their best player. And he would have kept playing even longer, but he and his wife started a dry cleaning business in Savannah, Georgia, that it just didn't make financial sense for him to continue playing baseball and being gone half the year when the business was doing so well. It was just like, all right, I'm just going to stay home and expand the business.
Yeah.
So he stopped playing baseball kind of for that reason. But yeah, I mean, he definitely had more productive years of baseball left in him when he was banned from major leagues.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those saddest stories of baseball.
In the Shoeless Joe Jackson card that you made where he's on the Greenville Spinners, you made his cap and the accent color on his uniform a dark red. Years ago when Ebbetsfield Flannels used to sell a 1908 Greenville Spinners cap, which was the team that Joe was discovered on for the major leagues, they made it a dark blue. I've never found verification one way or the other about what color the color scheme was back then. Do you remember how you decided to go with dark red? Do you remember seeing that stated somewhere? Because Greg Kreinler has painted Joe on the 1908 Greenville Spinners, and he also chose to use dark red. And if there are 2 people whose research I trust when it comes to colors, it's you and Greg. So I know this was more than 5 years ago that you made that specific card, but do you remember the research process for that team?
Yeah, it was really weird. I looked that up because you think Greenville would be green.
You would think.
Yeah. But when you look at old sporting catalogs where people would order uniforms, especially for a low minor league, they're usually the real low budget uniforms. And you had a choice of a blue hat or a red hat or a black hat or a white hat. Green was kind of a crazy color. You didn't get that until you ordered like the high class uniforms from Spalding or something that the major league players would use.
However, they were playing in Greenville, South Carolina, which was the textile capital of the world at the time. So it is possible that they had access to colors and dyes that an average team somewhere else in the country might not have had access to.
Yeah. So where did I come up with the red? I was corresponding with a guy from that part of the country, and he said that his grandfather always told him that it was red.
So we know that the 1932 Greenville Spinners team that Joe played on, after his career was over, like I said, they moved back to Savannah, Georgia. And in 1932, Joe's mom gets sick, and she was still living in Greenville. So Joe and Katie sold everything down in Savannah. They got rid of the businesses, and they moved back up to Greenville to take care of his mom. The Greenville Spinners find out that he's back in town after all this time, and they say, hey, do you want to come play? And he's 45 years old at this time. And he says, yeah, pay me $100 a game. I'll do whatever you want. And they're like, sure. That team was red. So the color of the Greenville Spinners in 1932 was red, but it was more of like a true red, like a cardinal red.
Right.
I don't know one way or the other if the 1908 team was, it's possible that the team switched colors between 1908 and 1932.
You'd totally be right, yeah.
That is a mystery that I have never fully solved.
Yeah, me neither. And I remember talking to Greg about that.
Yeah.
We were both throwing it around. And like I said, I just know that I corresponded with a guy who said that is, trust that if you want.
I get it.
Who knows?
Yeah. All right, who is your left fielder?
Blarney Bill O'Hara. He was a guy, he played in the major leagues, I think in 1910. Outfielder, very weak hitting, even for the dead ball era. He batted, maybe he broke 200 the 2 years that he played. But he had a very long minor league career. He was from Canada, and he was playing with Toronto when the First World War broke out. And right behind Toronto's stadium was a RAF training base for their pilots. Blarney Bill's out in the outfield every home game, and he's watching these new pilots taking off in these new airplanes. And he's just watching them fly overhead, and he's like, I want to be one of those guys. So after the 1915 season, he quits baseball and joins the Royal Canadian Air Force, or I think it was the Royal Flying Corps at the time. Trains as a pilot, gets shipped over to England. And something happened, and I've never been able to get the full story on it. He did something to crash a plane or did something with a balloon, an observation balloon. But whatever it was, he got kicked out of the Royal Flying Corps and sent to the infantry. He went overseas to France with the Canadian infantry. He was a lieutenant at the time, and they had trench raids, which the Canadians came up with. They would sneak in at night, dressed in black and stocking caps, and sneak into the German trenches and kill as many people as they can and try to figure out what units were there, and then sneak back if they weren't killed. Blarney Bill excelled at that. He made headlines by throwing grenades like a baseball, because he didn't throw grenades like a baseball back then. You kind of just lobbed it. But, he was an outfielder, so he would just start pitching grenades at the Germans. And he was finally wounded, I think, in the Battle of the Somme. He was blown up and buried. Wasn't injured, but it was enough to get him out of the war. He was too banged up. So he went back to Canada. I believe he played minor league ball for a little bit. But at the same time, he was trying all these new things for a career. And he came up with the idea of buying old observation balloons from the Army and sailing them in the far north of Canada and using a Lewis machine gun to gun down deer or big game. That never really panned out. So he went back to baseball, and he wound up becoming a front office guy for the Toronto minor league team. Passed away on a road game in New Jersey in the 1920s. But real interesting guy. When I was researching him, I don't know where the heck I dug this up, but I found an actual pamphlet when he went on a speaking tour of America in 1918 before the war ended. And it had a picture of him, in his Canadian uniform with a grenade and everything. But it told about his exploits throwing the grenades like a baseball.
So I've read that the size and shape of a grenade was made because the American Army was like, all American boys know how to throw a baseball. So if we make a grenade the same size of a baseball, it'll just be natural to them.
Actually, the grenade, as you know it now, it's based on a British Mills grenade. They're the ones that actually came up with that shape. But the way they taught it to throw, because British kids don't grow up throwing a baseball, it was to kind of just lob it over your head. Yeah, and the Canadians were the first ones during the wartime that was throw it like a baseball, because that's how they grew up throwing things.
Yeah.
And then, the Americans went from there.
Interesting. For my center fielder, I went with Willie Mays. At age 16, Willie Mays joined the Birmingham Black Barons of the Negro American League. The New York Giants purchased his contract in 1950, and he was in center field at the Polo Grounds by the next season and won Rookie of the Year in 1951, leading the Giants to the National League pennant. He spent most of 1952 and all of 1953 in the Army, but in 1954, Mays showed his all-around ability, leading the league with a .345 batting average and 13 triples, while blasting 41 home runs and ringing up 110 runs batted in. The Giants again won the pennant, this time also winning the World Series thanks to Willie's catch in Game 1, possibly the most famous defensive play in the history of baseball. He hit over 310 times, finishing with a .302 career batting average and 3,283 hits to go along with his 660 home runs. He was a two-time National League MVP in 1954 and 1965, a 24-time All-Star, and he won 12 Gold Glove Awards in center field. He led the league in home runs 4 times, in stolen bases 4 times, in slugging percentage 5 times, in total bases 3 times, and in triples 3 times. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Willie Mays.
One thing that I found recently, I was working on a story about this guy by the name of Joe Press. Never played in the major leagues, never played in the minor leagues, but he was the manager of a semi-pro team in Brooklyn called the Bushwicks. And it's probably the best semi-pro team of all time. And Joe Press was the manager of this team for about 10, 15 years. The Bushwicks would play white semi-pro teams, town teams, anybody that would go to Brooklyn. But they also played the best of the Negro League teams. So Press was in a position where he could actually scout the black teams after Jackie Robinson. He sort of had a working agreement with the Yankees. And when I was working on Joe Press, I found a copy of a letter that he had written to the Yankees front office after they refused to sign Willie Mays because he had scouted him when he was playing with Birmingham in 47 and 48. And it was basically him saying, why aren't you signing these guys? I can't take this anymore, that you're not signing these great players, and went on to list a few of the players that he'd given the Yankees a tip on. Yeah, he was really upset that his work was going to nothing. He was trying to give these guys a great start and give it to his favorite baseball team.
Right.
They were refusing to do it.
Yeah, I think Paul Referson had that letter in his show in New York. Okay, then who is your center fielder?
Jimmy Horio. He was the son of Japanese immigrants in Hawaii, and he wound up playing on the same team as Sig Jakuki in Hawaii, the Honolulu Braves. Great hitter, good enough that he wound up playing minor league baseball in America in the early 30s. He was maybe the first Japanese American that stuck in organized baseball. The guy was always dogged by personal tragedy. He was playing with a team that was the Sioux City Canaries in the early 30s, having a great season, and his wife got into a tragic car accident and died.
Wow.
So the rest of his season went to hell and never got promoted. I think he took a step back from baseball for a little bit and then went back to the minor leagues again. I can't remember exactly what happened to him again, but it was another tragic thing that I think his son might have passed away or something. It was just two terrible things that happened to this guy. Again, he was having a really good season. Everything just went to hell after that. By this time, it's 1934, and he reads about Babe Ruth and Connie Mack taking that great team over to Japan for that huge tour. So he knows he can't, obviously, he's not going to get invited to go over with the major leaguers. So what he does is he takes it upon himself to buy a steamship ticket to Japan and shows up at the training facility that the Japanese government had put together to have a team of amateurs coalesce into a team that actually became the Tokyo Giants eventually, to face Babe Ruth and the All-Stars. Talked his way onto the team, which was kind of hard to do because the Japanese really didn't think of him as Japanese.
Right.
But he was an American and knew how to play American baseball. So he wound up becoming their center fielder. But the reason Jimmy did this was because he wanted to impress the major leaguers and get a major league contract.
Right.
It didn't happen, but it got him a Pacific Coast League contract. He played a year or so in the Pacific Coast League, but aged out after a while. He was getting older. So he went back to Japan and played the first couple of seasons of Japanese professional baseball before World War II. And he went back to Hawaii before the war broke out. Japan was in a war with China at the time, and they were drafting everybody. And I think because he was living in Japan, he was liable to be drafted.
Oh, interesting.
So he left. But anyway, Jimmy's one of my favorite players because I just love that grit and determination. Like, I'm not making it here, but I'm going to do this. And just that grand gesture of going across an ocean and just showing up and be like, I'm playing for you. I'm your center fielder. Right. And just the drive that guy had every time he got beaten down, it just came back even better. So he's one of my favorite players.
I wonder how much a ticket on a steamboat to Japan would have cost back then.
It was expensive. Yeah. It was today probably a couple of $1,000s, I guess. Yeah.
Unbelievable. For my right fielder, I went with Mickey Mantle. And now, I know what you might be thinking, Mickey Mantle played center field. And yes, he mostly did, but a couple things. First, he played right field in his rookie year because the Yankees had Joe DiMaggio in center, so Mickey actually did play 147 games in right field during his career. Secondly, this is my ultimate fantasy team, and it's my ultimate fantasy to have an outfield with Shoeless Joe Jackson, Willie Mays, and Mickey Mantle in it. If you don't like that, you can make your own team, but this is mine. I'm picking Mickey here. He played his entire 18-year career with the New York Yankees, and the injuries he suffered may have never allowed him to live up to the potential he displayed to the team when he arrived in 1951. But despite never quite being at 100%, Mickey established himself as one of the game's best players. From 1953 to 1955, the switch hitter averaged 28 home runs, 98 runs batted in, and 118 runs per season. He led the American League in 1954 with 129 runs, and in 1955, he topped the American League with 37 home runs, a .431 on-base percentage, and a .611 slugging percentage. In 1956, he won the American League Triple Crown, batting .353 with 52 home runs and 130 RBI, and won the first of 2 consecutive AL MVP awards. In his first 8 seasons in New York, the Yankees won 7 American League pennants and 5 World Series titles. In 1962, He missed almost 40 games, but still managed to capture his third MVP title while bringing New York to its third consecutive pennant and second straight World Series championship. He was named to 20 All-Star games, won a Gold Glove for his play in center field in 1962, and was part of 7 Yankees teams that won the World Series. He hit a record 18 home runs in his 12 appearances in the Fall Classic. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Mickey Mantle.
Well, I thought you were going to pick him as your shortstop.
I could have. I could have done second
as...
baseman. He played at every position except for pitcher and catcher, I believe.
Yeah, it's scary to think, had that guy played at 100%.
Right.
I mean, was that guy playing at 80% most of his career?
If that.
Yeah, can you imagine what he would have been like in his permanently healthy state? Just unbelievable. What a great ball player. My favorite thing about Mickey Mantle is small, but it's kind of a neat little story. Whereas most ball players whose nickname is Mickey have another first name. Mickey Cochran, that wasn't his name. That was just his nickname.
Uh-huh.
Mickey Mantle, that was his real first name because his father was a big fan of Mickey Cochran, the catcher for the A's and the Tigers. So that was actually his first name. So I always thought that was a neat little thing about him. I mean, he was born with a baseball name.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't beat the name like Mickey Mantle.
And he was taught to be a switch hitter because his dad threw with one hand and his grandfather threw with the other hand.
Yep.
So they're just like, all right, we're drilling this in you from a very early age, and you're going to be a switch hitter.
Yep.
He was probably the best who's ever done it. All right, who is your right fielder?
When I wrote the story of this guy, I gave it the title, The Best Hitter You Never Heard Of, and he really is. His name was Fran Boniar. He signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1955, and he was an outfielder. He was just a tremendous hitter. At the time, the Dodgers had just won the World Series in 55, of course, and their outfield was getting kind of old. They never really had a permanent left fielder. They always had a problem filling that position. Center field, you had Duke Snider. He was getting a little up there. Carl Ferrello, who was in right field, was even older. So the Dodgers really would need help in the outfield in a few years. So in 1955, he's playing with the Dodgers farm team, and he hits something like 427. And that was the highest batting average in organized baseball, any league. And he won the Silver Slugger Award that year. He injured his back, and he had just horrible, debilitating back pain. So the next year, didn't do too good. He had some treatments. So the next year, in 1957, he comes back even better. And he hits even higher. I think he hit 1 percentage point higher than he did the time when he won the Silver Slugger. Wow. Wins a second Silver Slugger Award as the highest batting average in the minor leagues. The guy is just poised for Dodger greatness at this time. Another couple of years in the minor league system, and he'd be ready. That would have been time for 1959, early 60s with Koufax and the second revitalization of the Dodgers. Unfortunately, his back trouble never got better, and he just couldn't put it together and sank further and further down into the minor leagues and never made it to the majors. It was just always a shame. I mean, that guy was just such a tremendous hitter, just unbelievable. And it's interesting to think how better the Dodgers could have been if he would have made it up there and played outfield on those teams in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Because they had the great pitching staff,
Right.
Great infield. God, you would have had a guy like that in the outfield, and how many more pennants would that team have won?
One of the things I love about your work and your research is how many other players are there like this who we've just never heard of because they had a bad back or they missed a flight for their tryout. You know, like these great players, these great stories that just one thing went the wrong way and we never heard of them.
Yeah, that's I love the story of Steve Dalkowski. He's supposed to be the fastest pitcher of all time. Never played a game in the major leagues. But it came right down to, I believe it was the day before opening day. He's up with the Baltimore Orioles, and he's playing an exhibition game against the Yankees, and he blows his arm out. Right. I mean, the guy had a rookie card with Topps baseball cards at the time.
And they said he threw like 105 miles an hour, something crazy.
Yeah, and like the last game of spring training, he blows his arm out and never made it to the major leagues. I mean, what a shame.
All right, we're an American League team, so for my designated hitter, I went with Ted Williams. Williams won 6 batting titles, but that doesn't really explain his mastery at the plate. Thanks to an excellent batting eye, Williams led the American League in on-base percentage 12 times overall, including each season he played from 1940 to 49, when he missed 3 full years due to his service in the Marines. His .482 career on-base percentage is the best of all time. In his third big league season in 1941, Williams hit .406, and he's the last big leaguer to reach that 400 mark. Williams won the American League Triple Crown in 1942 with 36 home runs, 137 runs batted in, and a .356 batting average. He then spent 3 years serving his country during World War II as a pilot instructor. He returned to the big leagues in 1946, helping Boston win the American League pennant and winning the league's Most Valuable Player award. In 1947, Williams again won the league's Triple Crown. In 1949, He won his second MVP, missing out on a third Triple Crown because the Tigers' George Kell edged him out in the batting title race by .000156 points. Early in the 1952 season, at the height of the Korean War, Williams was recalled to duty by the Marines, who were in desperate need of pilots. He served in Korea for more than a year, flying combat missions in a Marine fighter jet and missing most of the 1952 and 1953 seasons. Williams was an all-star in every non-military interrupted season after his rookie campaign, totaling 19 all-star game selections. He hit .388 in his age 38 season in 1957, leading the big leagues, and then followed that up with another batting title in 1958 with a .328 mark. Williams led the American League in home runs 4 times, and his .634 career slugging percentage is second to only Babe Ruth all time. He finished his career with a .344 batting average, 521 home runs, 2,021 walks, and 1,839 RBIs. Numbers which would have been even more impressive had he not missed nearly 5 full seasons in his prime due to military service. We will never truly know how great Ted Williams could have been, but it's impossible to have a conversation about the greatest hitters of all time without including him. So that's why he's my DH. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Ted Williams.
He's one of those guys that showed promise as a kid. I mean, in 1936, he signs with the San Diego Padres. I believe a couple of major league teams offered him contracts, but his mom didn't want him to leave San Diego, which is where he lived. Mm-hmm. So he signs with the Pacific Coast League Padres, the top minor league team at the time. He plays the 1936 season with them. He plays in the Pacific Coast League playoff games. And then what does he do after that? He goes back to high school.
Right.
And finishes out his high school. So I just thought that was could you imagine being a junior in high school and you're playing in the top minor league at the time?
Yeah.
His first season in professional baseball. And you're in the playoffs and everything. And then you go, how do you go back to high school after that?
Right, yeah.
I believe somebody wrote a book that called him The Natural. And that's probably about as close as you could get to somebody who's just a natural ball player or just a natural hitter.
Yeah. All right, and then who was your DH?
Well, he's a Hall of Famer. I think that's the only Hall of Famer I have here. And just coincidentally is a Jersey guy, Joe Ducky Medwick. He's reputed to be one of the meanest guys to ever play baseball. He was just a surly dude. There's all kinds of great stories about him when he played with the Cardinals. One time, the pitcher for his own team criticized his play in the outfield as they were walking off the field at the end of the inning, and Medwick decked him, knocked him out cold on the mound. I mean, he was just that type of guy. When he left New Jersey, he signs with the Cardinals organization. He's playing in Houston. Also on the team is a guy you might have heard of, Dizzy Dean. Mm-hmm. And Dizzy Dean was just a ne'er-do-well type of dude, kind of a mooch. Medwick is just this hard-nosed, serious guy. It's just baseball. Leave him alone. Don't talk to him. But Dizzy Dean was all excited because he heard that Joe Medwick had this great East Coast wardrobe. They were the same size and he wanted to be his roommate. The two never really got along. But there's a great story when he's a very popular player with the Houston Buffaloes. So much so that a local confectionery decided to make a candy bar named after him, like Babe Ruth. Mm-hmm. Medwick had gotten a nickname that always dogged him in his career that he absolutely hated, Ducky Wucky, because his feet turned in. Mm-hmm. When he ran, he looked like a duck. Supposedly, a young girl fan in Houston called him that for the first time, but he hated that. He wanted to be called Mickey or Muscles. But Ducky always stuck. So anyway, when it came time to make this candy, they marketed it as the Ducky Wucky bar. And he did not like that at all, did not want to do it. Then he figured I was going to get a royalty for each one made and said, all right, well, I'll live with that. A couple of months later, the Cardinals finally called him up. And there's still a lot of these candies left. And so the guy that ran the candy store said, I still want to sell them. And Medwick said, no, you're not. You're not using my name. He spent the last day before he was called up to St. Louis sitting in the clubhouse, tearing the wrappers with his name on off these candy bars and tearing them up because he didn't want anybody to use his name and make money at it. Mm-hmm. And interesting enough, I wrote my book in 2015. As far as I know, up to that point, nobody had ever found a Ducky Wucky bar wrapper.
Interesting.
So when I did my illustration of him, I have him in the dugout with a big stack of these Ducky Wucky bars, and I came up with my own label. And I eventually wanted to make those.
Yeah, that'd be funny. All right, every team needs a manager, and for mine, I went with Joe McCarthy. McCarthy managed the Chicago Cubs from 1926 to 1930, where he had a .579 winning percentage and won a pennant. He became the Yankees manager in 1931 and won 8 pennants and 7 World Series titles by 1943. The Yankees won 4 titles in a row from 36 through 39 and made it 5 out of 6 when they won again in 1941. His .627 winning percentage as Yankees manager ranks first all-time in franchise history for anyone who managed more than 165 games. He resigned 35 games into the 1946 season and managed 2.5 more years in Boston after that, where he led the Red Sox to 2 second-place finishes in the American League. He was known as being strict but fair. In a time when players and managers were starting to wear uniform numbers, McCarthy opted not to wear one and deferred attention as much as possible to his star players. And he had a lot of them during his tenure. Joe DiMaggio said, "Never a day went by when you didn't learn something from Joe McCarthy." When he retired in 1950, he had compiled 2,125 wins, and his .615 winning percentage was the highest in baseball history. At that point, no manager ever had more than his 30 World Series victories. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Joe McCarthy.
He's one of my favorite guys, even though he was a Yankee for so long. A lot of people gave him bad press at the time when he was manager of the Yankees because, he won all those championships in the 1930s. They called him a push-button manager. Like he had just had all these great players, and all you had to do was fill their name in and push a button, and you get a home run or something like that, which to a certain extent is true. But when I first started looking at him, especially on those late 1930s teams, his pitching staff was usually pretty haphazard. You had Red Ruffing and Lefty Gomez as their 1-2 punch, which is great. They're both Hall of Famers, of course. But the rest of the pitching staff was kind of a mess. And every year you have a different crop of minor leaguers that would come on there. And he was able to definitely manage those guys and get the best they possibly could out of each guy just for 1 year, maybe 2 years. Guys like Tiny Bottom and pitchers that only had maybe 1 or 2 good years in the major leagues and kind of faded away into obscurity. But McCarthy's great asset was he was able to harness these guys and put together a pitching staff that would win the pennant every year. He was also really revolutionary in different ways, and one of my favorites is he was one of the first managers that made sure he had a dedicated batting practice pitcher follow the team and go on road trips with them. I believe he had 2 different guys during the 30s and 40s, but they were ambidextrous pitchers that were able to replicate the different pitchers that they were going up against on the road, which I thought was really cool. And the Yankees fortunately had a lot of money and they were able to pay for this while other teams couldn't. But he was the first guy that really thought of doing something like that, which was really interesting. It really made a difference on those teams, those great hitters, especially when you could face a guy that could replicate a different pitcher's pitching stance and motion.
Joe McCarthy would have been my pick for manager, but my mom's pick would have been Tris Speaker because of the job he did rallying the 1920 Cleveland Indians to a World Series win after the death of Ray Chapman. So I have to at least ask you about Tris really quickly and what you learned when you researched and wrote about him.
With him, I thought it was really interesting about how during that 1920 season, the team was really ripped apart between Protestants and Catholics. And there was a huge divide to the point where they didn't know where Ray Chapman was going to get buried. And I think his wife was one religion and he was a different. I just thought that was pretty crazy, especially in 1920, that religion could tear a team apart like that. And yet they were still able to win the pennant that year.
Okay, and then who is your manager?
That would be Morris Buttermaker from the Bad News Bears.
That's your favorite baseball movie, right?
That's my favorite baseball movie of all time. I just love it, especially that they don't win at the end. And it's just like, that's what life is, You don't always win. I mean, how lousy would that picture have been if they would have won at the end? I mean, what are they going to show?
It would have been a Full House episode.
Yeah, exactly.
You all hug at the end and go out for a Dairy Queen. No, that's not how life works.
And then they would have made 58 sequels and stuff. But, I just love that movie. It's just for how it echoes life and then also how baseball brings all these different people together. And I always love the story of Morris Buttermaker. Supposedly he played in the minor leagues with the Phoenix Senators and he struck out Ted Williams in spring training. So I wanted to do a baseball card of him of what he would have looked like in 1951. He said he was a pitcher with Phoenix or something like that. So I looked up what the old Phoenix Senators uniforms looked like, and I found a great picture of Walter Matthau from that time period and used that for the portrait that I did of him.
Awesome.
But I just love that movie. In fact, I have the team picture hanging on my wall.
Funny. And thank you for proving my point earlier about your sense of humor and your playfulness with the cards that you make sometimes.
Speaking of that, in the background of the Morris Buttermaker card, because during the movie, he's seen in every scene drinking a different type of cheap beer. And people play drinking games like that when they watch that movie. My friend Charlie Vassalero taught me that. But in the background, you could see a bunch of cheap beer billboards.
Awesome. See, that's the attention to detail that we've come to love about you, Gary. All right, for my hitting coach, I went with Ty Cobb. A lot of coaches are former players, but not many coaches are former superstars. Ted Williams was a mediocre manager and a worse hitting coach, and Babe Ruth coached for the Dodgers, but they thought so little of his coaching ability that they never really gave him any responsibility that was actual, real responsibility. Ted Lyons, Jimmy Fox, and Joe DiMaggio all had opportunities to mentor young players in various roles without much success. But Ty Cobb was different. From 1921 to 1926, Cobb was managing the Detroit Tigers while he was the team's starting center fielder. And while he didn't have much success as a manager, he did have incredible success teaching his players hitting. Hall of Famer Harry Heilman went into a month-long slump during the 1921 season, and Ty Cobb worked with him for hours every day to break him out of it. It worked so well that Heilman went on to hit .394 that season and win the batting title over Ty Cobb himself, who hit .389. He helped the batting averages of mediocre hitters increase, like Fred Haney, who hit .352 as a rookie for Cobb, Johnny Bassler, who hit .310, and Larry Woodall, who hit .351 in his first 2 seasons under Cobb. During Cobb's 6 seasons as Detroit's manager, the Tigers batted .323, .318, .310, .308, .310, and .299 as a team. And of those 6 seasons, 4 of them ended with a Tiger winning the batting title. Heine Manush, who won one of those batting titles, said, "Cobb was a master at getting you to work hard on your swing. I came away from my years in Detroit with a more intelligent idea of how to hit a baseball." And Connie Mack said, "Ty never had a good pitching staff. His outfield was bad defensively, and his infield was worse. He did as well with the material they gave him as anybody could have done. Boy, how those boys could hit and score runs. Ty coached them, and he kept them on their toes. Ty was a great coach. I doubt if his equal has ever lived." That's from Connie Mack. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Ty Cobb.
He came from a prominent Southern family, and being a ball player was the last thing his father wanted him to be. Just wasn't respectful at the turn of the century. So Ty Cobb leaves and goes to Augusta, Georgia, where there was a minor league team. And he gets signed, goes through spring training, lasted a couple of games, and let him go. So he didn't want to go home in disgrace. So he went over to Anniston, Alabama, where there was a semi-pro team at the time. So he hooks on with them, starts playing with them for a while. And what he did in his spare time at night was get a stack of postcards and write to all the sports writers in the South about this guy Cobb that you need to see. He's with this team in Anniston, and somebody needs to sign this guy. And finally, Grantland Rice, who was one of the great sports writers at the time, actually put it in one of his columns. There's this boy Cobb in Anniston that's really tearing up the... And Augusta wound up signing him again after he got all this publicity. But I just thought that was great. I just see Ty Cobb sitting in a hotel room or a boarding house, a shabby boarding house late at night with a suitcase, and he's writing these postcards and addressing them to different sports writers, mailing them the next day.
A very Ty Cobb story. All right, and who is your hitting coach?
Steve Bilko.
Yeah.
I just love this guy. And I knew who he was because he has a great name and he's Polish. And of course I knew about him. And I knew that Sergeant Bilko, the great television show from the 1950s, was named after Steve Bilko because the guy who starred in it was a huge baseball fan. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really know the ins and outs or how great this guy was until the Baseball Reliquary in Pasadena, California honored me one year. And at the same time, Steve Bilko was being inducted into their Hall of Fame. So his family was there, and 2 Pacific Coast League historians were there. They did the preamble to his induction. And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, this guy is great. Yeah. I got to write something about this guy. Yeah, he was just a great hitter, but he'd call big boned. He was a big dude. And when he came up with the Cardinals in the late 40s, early 50s, he was way what was considered overweight. But that's just the way he was. He just had a big frame. So the Cardinals would try to make him lose weight every spring. And he would lose all this weight, and then he couldn't hit because he didn't have his power anymore. So they'd send him back to the minor leagues, and he'd gain weight again, and then go back to the Cardinals, and they'd make him go on a crash diet. There's one story, I think it was in 1950. He lost all this weight, and his mother came to see him play, and she didn't even recognize him because he was so thin. Wow. But yeah, that's what happened with his major league career. And the Cardinals finally got rid of him, and he went to play with the Los Angeles Angels in the Pacific Coast League. Wins the home run title in 1955. And then in 56, he does the same. And he wins the Triple Crown out there, set the record for home runs in the PCL at the time. Had just another tremendous season. And he actually signed a contract with the Angels that said, I don't want to get sent to the major leagues, because he was just having such a great time down there. But the key to his success with the Angels was they just left him alone. Do whatever you want. Drink as much beer as you want, eat as much as you want, just hit the ball, and that's what he did.
Keep winning Triple Crowns, you do whatever you want.
Exactly, yeah. There's these great stories about him. He was a tremendous beer drinker. He just loved his beer. he would sit in the clubhouse and drink a 6-pack and then go home after a game. There's another story, I believe it was when he was still with the Cardinals. They ordered him to lose all this weight, so he came up with his own sauna routine where he'd take a 6-pack into the bathroom and turn the heat up all the way in the tub and just sit there, knock off the 6-pack, and that was his sauna time. So anyway, I just love that guy. I think he's the best.
I love the culture of the clubhouse you're creating here.
It's baseball. You got to have fun.
It's a long season. There are some players who you've created multiple cards for over the years, and Steve Bilko is one of those players. You made one card for him in 2019 and then another in 2022. What makes you decide to revisit a player?
The first one I did was a batting stance of him on the 56 Angels, because the Angels had these crazy uniforms. They only made them once. Mm-hmm. They were called waffle weave, and it was this stretchy fabric they put going down the legs and then also underneath the arms. And it was this great red, white, and blue kind of plaid pattern. You have to look it up. I can't even give it adequate attention to how cool these things were.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wanted to show the full uniform, so I had him in the batting stance. You could see the leg and everything. Then later on, when I did a second version of him, I did it for a different series. I did the first one for a minor league home run heroes. Mm. So I didn't want people that had that card to get just the same one again. So I did a portrait of him.
Cool. For my pitching coach, I went with Tommy Lasorda. Lasorda managed the Los Angeles Dodgers from 1976 to 1996, winning 1,599 games, 8 division titles, 2 World Series, and then 2 more National League pennants on top of that. Lasorda got his start in pro baseball at the age of 18 as a left-handed pitcher when he signed with the Phillies in 1945, but then served 2 years in the military. In 1948, he returned to baseball with the Schenectady Blue Jays and authored a 25 strikeout performance. 25 strikeouts! In 1949, the Dodgers drafted him from the Phillies, and he pitched for the Greenville Spinners and the Montreal Royals as well. During his time with the Royals, Lasorda led his team to 4 minor league championships. He made his major league debut in 1954 and played for the Dodgers for 2 seasons before being traded to the Kansas City Athletics, where he pitched for 1 season. In his 21 years as manager for Los Angeles, the Dodgers led the National League in team ERA 8 times and finished second another 7 times. They finished either first or second in strikeouts 7 times as well. When it came to Cy Young Awards, they fared pretty well too, with 2 wins, 5 second-place finishes, and 3 third-place finishes under Lasorda's watch. So I would feel more than comfortable with him as the pitching coach for my Ultimate Fantasy team. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Tommy Lasorda.
He's one of those guys that reached a point in his career where it couldn't win either way. When he got sent down to Montreal for like the 3rd or 4th time in the late 50s, he was really dejected because he's like, I have the stuff that can make it in the major leagues. He's a 20-game winner in the minors so many times over. He's probably the greatest pitcher in Montreal minor league history. But the Dodgers gave up on him. He was stuck in AAA. There's nothing you can do about it. So he could have just been bitter, and he was for a time. He could have just been bitter and said, screw this, I'm getting out of this. I'm going back to Norristown, Pennsylvania, and working a factory or something. But he didn't. Reason why was somebody in the Dodgers organization liked what he was like in a clubhouse. He had a natural ability to take guys under his wing and help out. So the Dodgers recognized this and convinced him to try coaching. And that's what he did when he went to the Los Angeles Angels in 57, before the Dodgers moved west the next year. He was a part-time coach, kind of a helper for the manager at the time. Worked his way up from the low minors as a coach to a manager. Worked his way up through AAA and everything, came up to the Dodgers. But I always thought it was interesting that so many people would have just given up. I mean, and he was angry at the time.
Oh, yeah.
I guess he did have a right to be. He always joked and said that it was Sandy Koufax that they gave a spot to on the Dodgers.
Right, yeah, I love that.
And I'd be kind of pissed at that, too. But yeah, I just love his story because so many times in life you just want to give up. You get dejected and angry and stuff like that. And he didn't do that. He took it in an entirely different direction. And is he in the Hall of Fame?
Oh, yeah, it's a manager,
so
absolutely.
It took him all the way to the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it as a pitcher, but he could do it as a manager. And that's great. I love that determination.
Yeah. All right, and then who is your pitching coach?
It's a guy by the name of Farmer Dean.
Yes, tell me this story.
He's a guy I found. I was doing a piece on the 1935 Tokyo Giants when they toured the West Coast in the United States. They played a lot of Pacific Coast League teams in spring training. Every time I would look up a Tokyo Giants game, there would be a mention of this guy, Farmer Dean. And I was like, who the heck is this guy? Turns out he just showed up in one of the Pacific Coast League teams' spring training. This is 1935, the depths of the Depression. People are starving. Nobody has jobs. So this guy shows up. He says he's like 22 years old. He looks like he's about 39. He shows up wearing a pair of overalls and a sign tacked to his back that says, I am Farmer Dean. And he says he's the greatest pitcher of all time. He's related to Dizzy and Daffy Dean, who just tore it up for the Cardinals the year before. And he has his own publicity guy coming with him. Give me a tryout. He stunk. He couldn't play. But what he excelled at was eating. Like I said, this is during the Depression. People are starving. Baseball players had great meals, especially during spring training. So he would show up early in the morning, have 3 or 4 breakfasts, and then show up at lunch and have steaks and everything and charge it back to the team until the team finally caught on that he wasn't a really good baseball player and dump him. And then he would show up in another Pacific Coast League training team because they hadn't heard of him yet. And he would do the same thing. So that whole spring training, now he's with the San Francisco Missions. Yeah, now he's with the LA Angels. And he's here, he's there. And the best thing was, they'd write about him, say, Farmer Dean, and give his weight, and it'd be like 170. And then the next team is with Farmer Dean, 180. And he wound up ballooned to like 40 pounds or something over spring training before they finally got rid of him. I never found out exactly who he was. But yeah, for a time, a couple of months in 1935, he was the thing.
That's awesome. Just eating his way through the Pacific Coast
League.
Yeah,
so I figure if he was able to talk his way onto all those Pacific Coast League teams, that's my pitching coach. Because he'll talk anybody into anything.
All right, listen, 162 games is a lot of baseball. And frankly, I'm just not going to always have time to watch or listen to every single game all season long. So we're going to need somebody to write about our team so we can keep up with them. For my beat reporter, I went with Jack Kerouac. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about him.
I love Jack Kerouac's poetry and writing. And if you read On the Road, there's a great passage where he and Dean Moriarty, I want to say they're in New Jersey, on a break from a road trip, going back and forth to Florida, moving furniture or something like that. And the two of them, they got a television game on. They got another television set on in another room, and then like 2 radios. So they're listening to like the Philadelphia teams and the New York teams playing all at the same time. They're going back and forth, and it's like, Philadelphia just scored a run. And I just love that because, you think about poets and you just think of the real effeminate type of guy or something. Jack Kerouac, he was a baseball player. He was a football player at Columbia, and he loved the game. And he was just a guy's guy. But the best thing about him is throughout his entire writing career, he was hanging out with all these proto-hippies and everything. One thing he always carried with him, besides a typewriter and a pencil, was this special baseball dice card game that he came up of his own making that he had played ever since he was a kid. Not only did he have this game that he had, but he had a whole universe built around it. He had whole teams. Usually he would name them after cars. It would be like the Pittsburgh Chevys or something like that. Came up with his own baseball players and histories behind all the baseball players. After he finished a game, he would write the game story and put it in a newsletter for himself. I guess that's probably where he got his taste for writing as a young man. But he continued to do that all the way up until the time he died in 1969.
All right, and then who's your beat reporter?
Robert L. Ripley. I remember Ripley was Believe It or Not when you were a kid in the newspaper, or the television shows, or the museums even. I probably got one of my first loves for drawing from Ripley's cartoons in the newspaper every day. I used to cut them out. But he was also a huge baseball fan. He actually tried out for the New York Giants at one point in the early 1920s. He was a big man about town in the 20s, and he knew all the sports writers, and of course he knew John McGraw and all the guys on the Giants. So he would go to spring training with them all the time. There's a couple of pictures of him in a New York Giants uniform pitching. And he was also a great writer. He liked to tell stories like I do. So yeah, that's the guy I'm picking to write my game stories.
Cool. Similarly, we're going to need someone to be kind of a cheerleader for each of our teams, who's going to be at every game, making sure that the crowd is into it and supporting our players through the ups and downs of such a long season. So for my number one fan, I went with Andy the Clown. Tell us who he is and what you learned when you researched and wrote about him.
He was a guy from the south side of Chicago. The story goes, in 1959, his local bowling team won tickets to a White Sox game at Comiskey Park. So a bunch of guys were going to go, and just for kicks, he dressed up as a clown. And people at the game loved it. So he started going to White Sox games dressing up as Andy the Clown. And he, over time, became a fixture at Comiskey Park. He used to have a little catchphrase where he'd go, "Go you White Sox!" And if you go on YouTube and you listen to games from Comiskey Park in the 1960s or 70s, sometimes you could actually hear him in the background.
Oh, yeah.
And he had like a light up red nose, and kids would come over and pinch his nose. And this was before people were scared of clowns or they had bad names and stuff like that. But he was never paid for or sanctioned by the White Sox or anything like that. He would just show up. And eventually Bill Veeck, when he ran the White Sox, gave him season tickets so he didn't have to pay for his own ticket anymore. But that was the extent of him being paid. He just did it because because he loved kids and he loved people and loved the White Sox.
Yeah.
It's probably the scariest drawing I've ever done.
Yeah.
I've gotten really bad feedback on that one, but I love it. I think it's pretty cool.
Me too, yeah.
Just an interesting guy. Because I love outsider baseball, which is just guys that play outside the parameters of Major League Baseball or aren't stars. And he's like the only outsider mascot I can think of.
All right, and who's your number one fan?
Guy by the name of Emery Tittman.
Yeah, tell me about him.
He's the biggest fan.
Literally, yeah.
Yeah, he was came from a rich Philadelphia family at the turn of the century, and he loved the Philadelphia Athletics. And because he was rich, he would go to spring training wherever the A's were and became friends with the team. And he would actually travel with the team on road trips. And his big thing was he was big. He was probably about 450 to 500 pounds. Nobody really knows for sure. Some people say it was a ton in the newspapers. But Connie Mack actually legitimately contracted with a tent maker to make him his own A's uniform. And he would work out with the team in spring training or sometimes for regular Major League games. Because of his size, he had health problems. And a doctor at one point said, "You've only got 6 months to live." Like I said, he was independently wealthy, so he did what anybody would do. He took all his money and just had blowout parties for the ball players, would take everybody out to dinner, followed the team around everywhere. The doctor was wrong. He didn't die. And 6 months later, he's still alive and he was broke.
Yeah.
He wound up becoming a masseuse in Atlantic City and different side businesses. I think he lived for another 15 years or something like that and then just passed away. But he was a big deal at the time, literally a big deal at the time. But all the newspapers that covered the Athletics would write about him. If he traveled anywhere, they would write about him because he had a special car and special transportation and stuff like that. And he loved it. He was just a big, warm-hearted guy. Seems like he'd be really cool to hang out with, and plus he'd pick up the tab.
Yeah. For a while at least.
Yeah.
All right, you can't play a game without an umpire, so let's put Albert Dolly Stark behind home plate. Tell us who he is and what you learned when you researched and wrote about him.
That's one of my favorite guys. I never thought I'd really write about an umpire before, but when I found out about Dolly Stark, I'm like, I gotta. He tried playing minor league baseball. I believe he got up to the Jersey City Skeeters at one point, which was the International League, so almost made it to major leagues, but he just wasn't good enough. He was small. Most teams didn't think he can last the whole season of Major League Baseball. So almost by accident, he started umpiring games. And he worked his way up where he was the Ivy League umpire for baseball for many years. And then the National League kind of took notice of him. And he was revolutionary at the time because where most home plate umpires would just sit behind home plate, he would dodge and weave and try to follow the ball and see where it was going so he can get a better look whether it was a ball or strike, more accurate. And the players loved that because when Dolly made the call, it was probably right. He was also the first umpire that would dash out from home plate and follow the batter as he ran to first base in case there was a close play. So he was the first umpire that really jumped around and ran around and made it a physical sport, kept in really good shape, and plus he was ex-athlete, so he was in good shape. And the players just loved him. But after his first season, the players would needle him and everything and call him names and stuff because that's what ball players did his first year in the National League. And he didn't think he was doing a good job and he quit. Other umpires actually took him aside and convinced him to come back. This is during the 1930s. So he was a National League umpire for most of the 1930s until I think it was 1937. He didn't like the amount of money that an umpire was making because they had to provide for their own travel. They couldn't travel with the baseball teams. They had to stay in separate hotels than the ball players. He didn't like that, so he staged the first strike for an umpire. And the National League told him to get lost. So what did he do? He went to Philadelphia and became the color man for the A's and the Phillies at the time. He was one of the first ex-jock color guys. And he did a great job. But the radio station that broadcast both those games sold the rights, so he was out of a job after that first season. Went back to umpiring again and did that for a few more seasons until his knees finally gave out on him because he was jumping up and down all the time.
Yeah.
But I believe the Major League Baseball players voted him best umpire in both leagues or something twice. To this day, still the only umpire that was given his own day in a Major League ballpark. They had Dolly Stark Day at the Polo Grounds.
Cool.
Because everybody just loved this guy. Now, after his baseball career was over, he tried to come back. His knees just wouldn't do it. He was like a Renaissance man. But my favorite thing that he did after he left baseball was he started his own garment company and came up with something called the Dolly Stark dress. And after World War II, it was really popular for a time. And there was all these press clippings and photos I found of him hawking these dresses on 7th Avenue in New York after the war. And coming from a garment family, I really liked that part of him.
Yeah.
When I did my story on him, I couldn't find what a Dolly Stark dress was. When they showed him with it, they only showed part of the dress, but I finally tracked down one of them.
Cool.
And I was able to do a fashion drawing of what the Dolly Stark dress looked like in 1947.
Yeah, that's
but
awesome.
Just a neat guy. Was really into everything. He was into, I think he sold stocks at one point. He just did everything.
All right, even though Dolly Stark was running all over the field, it's still tough to umpire the entire field alone. So let's throw a partner out there for him. Charles Square Deal Cromwell can be the second umpire for us. Tell us who he is and what you learned when you researched about him.
He was a Baltimore native, so umpired most games in Baltimore in the 1920s. This was rare at the time because most Negro League teams would hire white umpires, or if they rented out a stadium, white umpires were provided by the stadium management. Cromwell was different because he was black. And this was at a time in the 1920s when Negro League was real rough sport. White teams, too, were really tough, but Negro Leagues were especially so. Guys were trying to hold on to their place on a team, and if somebody called a strike against them and they didn't like it, they were going to let them know about it, or they were going to hit them. This is rough times. They wouldn't do that against white umpires because of all the prejudice back then and the lopsided laws and stuff like that. So it actually helped black teams if they had white umpires because they wouldn't get threatened or hurt. Cromwell was different, but he was actually a good umpire and people respected him. So he avoided a lot of those problems and was, I guess, what you'd call a trailblazer for the time.
Yeah. We're going to need a bat boy for this game, and I think one guy can handle the work for both teams, so let's go with Eddie Bennett. He was born in 1903 in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn. In 1918, both of his parents died during the influenza epidemic, and in 1919, he went to a Yankees game at the Polo Grounds against the White Sox. Happy Felsch noticed Eddie's smile and said to his teammates, "A hunchback should be lucky," since Eddie had an accident as an infant which left him with a serious spinal injury. Felsch indeed had a great game that day, so he and Eddie Seacott persuaded manager Kid Gleason to hire Eddie as their bat boy and unofficial mascot. When the Black Sox scandal left Felsch and Seacott banned for life, Eddie Bennett was out of a job. He started going to games at Ebbets Field in 1920, and one of the Brooklyn Robins players decided that he could be their good luck charm. And they were right too, and they went on to win the pennant that year before losing to Cleveland in the World Series. He became the Yankees mascot and bat boy in 1921 and stayed there for 12 years. During those 12 years, the Yankees won 7 pennants and 4 World Series titles. Joseph Herzberg wrote about Bennett saying, "He was the envy of the kids who wondered why Eddie got paid for what they considered a rare and wondrous privilege, not only of seeing a ball game for free every day, but of sitting on the same bench and rubbing shoulders with Ruth, Gehrig, and all the rest of the mighty men of Yankee Stadium." Eddie was always the first to shake the hand of a Yankee slugger after a home run, and he became integral to the rituals of many players. Many of the players wouldn't allow anyone besides Eddie to handle their bats, even after Eddie was given an assistant. He doted on Babe Ruth and knelt alongside him in the on-deck circle before each at-bat. He had a sad and tragic end to his life, unfortunately, but what a life he lived. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about Eddie Bennett.
Supposedly this story is the White Sox refused to take him on road games during the 1919 World Series, and they lost. And then the Dodgers did the same in 1920. They refused to take him along when they played the Indians in the 1920 World Series. And the Dodgers lost. The Yankees never made that mistake. He always accompanied the team on road games, especially in the World Series. But I always thought it was neat how much the players really loved that guy. Ruth especially had an affinity towards him, and they had a really good friendship. They used to do this little skit before some games where Ruth and Eddie would play catch. And after each throw, they'd move a step closer. And Ruth wouldn't let up. And he just fired a ball in on it. Poor little guy, And crowds ate it up. It was a different time back then. Nowadays, nobody would do that. But Eddie loved it. We went along with it. It was one of the things that made him famous all over the place. But yeah, kids loved him, looked up to him. And I thought it was neat. He had like a catalog of all the different players' phobias and things like that. Like some players did not want to see hairpins on the floor, or other players did want to see it. So sometimes he would supposedly sprinkle them around players that liked that and make sure he collected them for the players that didn't. And, he'd run little errands for everybody. And yeah, he was just a really loved little guy.
That's funny. All right, we're going to need someone to sing the national anthem before the game. So let's go with Kitty Burke. Tell us who she is and what you learned when you researched and wrote about her.
That was something I was really proud of when I did my book, research-wise. This is great. She was a banjo-playing blues singer in the nightclubs of northern Kentucky. Now, back then, you had Bellevue and Newport right across the river from Cincinnati, and they were the Sin Cities. Cincinnati was a strict Catholic place. Right across the bridge were these two towns that had nightclubs and gambling and booze and shows and all kinds of crazy stuff. Kitty Burke was a popular entertainer at the time in the 1930s. And in 1935, the Cincinnati Reds had the first night games in the major leagues, and they played one night game against all the teams in the National League. When the Cardinals were in town, they were the defending National League champs. So besides it being a night game, which would have been a sellout anyway, it was the Cardinals, so it was a huge deal. And Kitty Burke paid a lot of money to get a box seat right along the first baseline. But the overflow crowd was so much, she got forced out onto the field, and she was a little upset. So she starts heckling the Cardinals players, calling them names and stuff like that, joking with them, especially with Joe Medwick. And surprisingly, he actually played along with him. And Dizzy Dean's brother, Paul Dean, was pitching. And it got to the point where fans are just all over the field. Kitty Burke is heckling Paul Dean, saying, anybody could hit you. I could hit you. And he says, oh, yeah, you can't do it. So Babe Herman is at bat for the Reds. Kitty Burke walks out onto the field and takes the bat out of Babe Herman's hands and steps in. Paul Dean's standing on the mound, and he looks at the umpire, and the umpire kind of shrugs and bends down. And he starts to wind up. And Paul Dean was probably among the fastest pitchers at that time before he hurt himself. So he winds up like he's going to fire one in there like crazy because this is his livelihood. It's not a joke. So finally somebody tells him, ease off, ease off, ease off. And he slows up, and he kind of lobs the ball in there, and she hits it first base, but she was tagged out, and that was it. But to this day, she's the only woman who ever came to bat in an official major league game. Nobody knew what ever happened to her afterwards. I tracked down her family. Turns out she changed her name. She became a nurse up in Michigan, got married, and lived happily ever after.
That's pretty incredible.
But her history kind of just disappears after that one blip in history in 1935. But the Reds actually gave her a uniform, and she would do her nightclub routine in Newport and Bellevue wearing the Reds uniform.
Cool. All right, and along those lines, we're going to need someone to sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game during the 7th inning stretch. Let's go with Frank Sinatra. Tell us what you learned when you researched and wrote about him.
Yeah, he was a big baseball fan. I believe he started out as a Dodger fan when he grew up in Hoboken, New Jersey. There's a bunch of pictures of him in the stands at Ebbets Field in the 1940s. Later on, when the Dodgers moved out west, he was a Dodger fan. He was obviously friends with Tommy Lasorda. Those guys used to pal around all the time. Mm-hmm. During World War II, I think he had flat feet. He wasn't drafted, didn't serve in the Army. But to do his part, he'd do USO shows. But he also started his own baseball team of Hollywood stars and singers, and they would play other teams of nightclubs and things like that, and they'd donate the money to charities for the servicemen. He named this team the Hollywood Swooners because that's what teenage girls used to do. They'd swoon over Frankie Sinatra. Yeah. But yeah, he went out of his way to get the best players that he could possibly get out of the nightclub crowds. And I think his team probably lasted up until the mid-1950s in different iterations with different players.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. We're going to need a broadcast crew for this team. I'm not sure I can think of anyone more knowledgeable to talk about the game than John Thorne. Tell us who he is and why he would be a good choice for our play-by-play man.
Anybody who's seen Ken Burns' baseball knows who John Thorne is. Probably has the most airtime of any historian that they interviewed on there. I guess his specialty is 19th century baseball, but currently he's the official historian of Major League Baseball. What a great guy. Back when I first started my blog, somebody sent me a screen capture of a Twitter account, and I didn't even know what Twitter was at the time. I didn't have an account or anything like that. But it was John Thorne saying something about a story that I wrote. I was like, oh my God, this guy's famous. And anyway, I wound up corresponding with him, and I guess you could say I'm friends with him. I'll write to him all the time about different things that I'm researching, especially if it's something outside of my wheelhouse, like 19th century baseball. Mm-hmm. I was doing a story about a baseball player in 1875, and I had a question about uniforms. So I fired off an email to John Thorne. 20 minutes later, I get this big email package of all these catalogs from 1875 showing the stuff that they would have ordered for the team. So I was able to figure out, I think it was a belt I had questions about, what that looked like and what the shoes would have looked like. Anyway, besides being just a tremendous historian and an asset to baseball, he's just a great, friendly guy, and I'm proud to call him one of my friends and that I reach out to him like that. It's always great when you meet somebody who's famous or well-known and they actually turn out to be a good guy. I've met a lot of famous people, and they turn out to be not great people. So I'm always surprised when somebody like John Thorne turns up, somebody that doesn't have to be like that. Mm-hmm. And I found a lot of baseball historians that way too, which is really nice and helpful too. Those guys were really helpful to me when I first started and learning how to research. So anytime I get an inquiry from somebody who's doing the same thing starting off, I try to go out of my way to be as helpful as possible to kind of pay that back to those guys that helped me, especially John Thorne.
Absolutely.
I can't think of a better guy to have in the play-by-play booth than John. The one drawback might be he might be more interesting than the game that's going on, on the field.
It's okay. All right, if these games are going to be on TV, we're going to need someone to run the cameras for us. And the only person I know of who has experience behind a camera is Mo Berg. So tell us who he is and what you learned when you researched and wrote about him.
Yeah, Mo Berg was a catcher, another New Jersey guy. He was from Newark. He was a star athlete in high school, Newark High School. Went to Princeton, played baseball for that team, shortstop at the time. He studied languages, and supposedly he knew like 13 languages. I don't think he was really fluent in that many languages, but he had working knowledge of a tremendous amount of dead and modern languages. But instead of pursuing a career in academia, which he very well could have, when he graduated in the early 1920s, he signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers, or the Brooklyn Robins as they were back then, and played shortstop or infield for them. He wasn't great. He was good enough to be a player in the major leagues. I mean, that's something. But unlike most ball players where they would go hunting in the wintertime or take a job, Berg would go to Paris and study at the Sorbonne. He wound up getting his law degree during his playing years with the Dodgers. I think at Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. His career never really panned out, but he was never sent down to the minors. He kind of bumped around from team to team, where he earned a reputation as being the most eccentric guy in the major leagues. One of my favorite stories about him is he would read as many newspapers as he could possibly get, and plus he knew different languages. He would get French newspapers and German newspapers and stuff like that. He wouldn't let anybody touch a newspaper unless he declared it dead. And then he'd say, okay, that newspaper's dead. You could take that and look at it. But you couldn't touch a live newspaper if you were a teammate of his. The great story about him is he's with the White Sox. Again, he's a utility infielder. And the White Sox went through 2 or 3 catchers in the game. They got broken fingers. They were running out of guys, so there was no dedicated catcher. So the manager's looking around to see who could fill in as catcher. So Berg supposedly pointed to the guy next to him and said, he'll do it. The manager thought Berg said it. So he said, all right, put stuff on, go out there. So he shrugged and put the catcher's gear on, caught the first game he ever did in his entire career, and started his second career as a backup catcher. Mm-hmm. I guess he was so well thought of when Connie Mack put the team together with Babe Ruth, take it over to Japan. Who was the backup catcher? Mo Berg.
Yeah.
That's a guy that probably shouldn't have been there because everybody else was a superstar. Most of those guys wound up in the Hall of Fame. And then Mo Berg. Now, Berg was famous for dressing up as a Japanese woman in drag. Granted, this guy is built like an athletic dude. So he dresses up in Japanese drag and goes to a hospital in the middle of Tokyo, goes up to the roof, takes out a movie camera that he bought specially for this occasion, and filmed a 360-degree panorama of Tokyo. And when he got back to the United States, he gave it to the United States military to use because he foresaw us fighting Japan eventually, which, of course, we did. Mm-hmm. Supposedly, his films were part of the briefing when Billy Mitchell bombed Japan in 1942.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories about him is they get on the boat to leave America to go to Japan, and Babe Ruth goes, do you speak Japanese? Because he knew Mo speaks all these languages, and Mo goes, oh, no, that's one of the languages I don't speak. And so they get off the boat, and Mo greets the Japanese delegates in fluent Japanese. And then, that night, Babe Ruth goes up to Mo, you lied to me. He goes, no, that was 2 weeks ago when you asked me that. I didn't speak Japanese back then.
Yep. Yeah, and then after World War II, he joined the OSS, which was the forerunner of the CIA, parachuted into Yugoslavia during the war. That is his second career as a spy, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. All right, normally I like to ask people the time machine question. If you had a time machine, you could go back and watch one baseball game in history. Which game would you like to be in the stands for? And you're more than welcome to answer that question. But I also realize that neither of us have picked the location for our ultimate infinite teams to play this game. So I'll leave that up to you. Any location in baseball history, anywhere in the world, any time period, where would you want to watch this game take place? And where would you want to be sitting for it?
That's a good question. I would have said Ebbets Field years ago. But I've gotten more of a liking to old Crosley Field in Cincinnati.
Interesting. Why did that
switch
happen?
I just love the urban backdrop. I mean, all those great ballparks are in the city, but if you look at pictures of the outfield in Crosley Field, it's factories. It's dense. It's really cool looking. I love that. I've drawn that many times in the background of my players that I do. Any excuse I can do Crosley Field, I'll do. It just has a great looking scoreboard. It just has everything. I just love that urban environment. Just a lot of history there. Not always good. Mm-hmm. First night game. I would like to go back and watch the 1935 Reds or something like that.
Yeah, cool.
Or I'd like to see Johnny Vandermeer pitch, say 1938, I guess. I just think that'd be the coolest thing. What's yours?
I have always said the 1933 Negro League All-Star Game at Comiskey Park because I am a White Sox fan. I grew up in Chicago. And I have been to Comiskey Park, but I was 3.5 years old when that place got torn down. So, I don't remember it 1933 is like in its prime. It's been around for 23 years now at this point, so it's lived in, but it's still early enough that like things still look fresh and new. And I've never seen any of these Negro League guys play. You know, like you could say, sure, the 1933 white All-Star game would be just as exciting, but I've seen video of Babe Ruth. I've seen video of Lou Gehrig. Like, I've never seen video of real gameplay from the guys who were in the Negro League All-Star game that year. And it's a who's who of the black baseball stars. And it's an exciting game. That's my time machine game. I just want to be in Comiskey Park watching these heroes who I've never seen play ever. Yeah. That's where I would go. Okay. How can people reach out to you and keep up with what you're doing these days?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is studiogaryc.com, GARYC.com. Yeah, you can see my regular artwork there, and you can also go to my baseball blog, which has all my stories that I write and all my illustrations. It's free. You don't have to pay anything for it.
How far back does that go?
2017?
Yeah,
2017. Yeah, I had an earlier blog, and this one is a refresh. Yeah, and sometimes I bring over some of the older stories and refresh them.
Yeah. And what about social media?
Yeah, Facebook, Gary Joseph Cieradkowski. Instagram is Infinite Card Set, and Twitter is Gary Baseball Art. I really never mastered the social media thing where it should have the same name.
It's all right. That's why we have links on the liner notes. People just click. Tell me about the subscription series that you do and how people can sign up for that to support you if they want.
Yeah, you get one booklet a month, and it's usually between 8 pages and 28 pages. Usually it's on the longer side nowadays. You get a booklet and a card in the mail that's tipped in. It's part of the booklet. You get one a month, and then for subscribers, you get a subscriber special at the end of the year. That's one I usually like to have fun with. Like the Joe Schlabotnik card was part of that.
Yeah.
And you could also buy the booklets separately if you want.
Cool. You also have an email newsletter, which is always a fun and informative read. What is your favorite part about writing that newsletter, and where can people go to sign up for that if they want to get future emails sent directly to their inbox?
You could just write to me via my website or Twitter or Facebook or any of those things. I also have a Substack that you can subscribe to.
Yeah, cool. Well, I can't thank you enough for the inspiration that you've been to me over the past 15 years and for the legitimacy that you've brought my podcast since before it even launched. The first episode of My Baseball History went live on May 6th, 2020, coincidentally during the pandemic, when everybody was starting podcasts because they were going stir crazy. So when I'd tell someone, oh, hey, I've got this podcast, the initial reaction was usually, cool, so does literally everybody else. But then I'd give them my business card with the information on it, and they'd see your artwork. And you could just see the shift in their perception, like, oh, no, this is legit. I know that my association with the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum helped me get some interviews in the first season or two. But a huge reason that people have given me their time over the past 5 years, 6 years doing this show now, and especially before this show had 40 episodes of archives to prove its worth, was because your artwork just gave me instant credibility. So thank you for taking a chance on me and for your time and your friendship ever since. It really means a lot that you sat down with me today. So thank you, Gary.
Well, I really appreciate it, and thanks for saying that. That means a lot to hear that. That's really neat. I just want to thank you for actually contacting me to do the artwork. That was really cool. I'd never done a podcast logo or icon before, and I don't listen to baseball podcasts very often. Yours I always tune into.
Thank you.
I love the long format, and the guests are just great.
Thank you. Yeah. I remember when I initially messaged you about doing the artwork, like you were hesitant because the size was going to be so small. It's a thumbnail. And I don't listen to a ton of podcasts, but I see all the artwork on them. And like some of the artwork is incredibly detailed. And I'm like, trust me, it's going to work. Like if you do what you do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I love it so much. And I get so many, to this day, so many compliments about it. So
it's great to hear.
Thank you very much. You knocked it out of the park.
Well, it's great to have it associated with such a great podcast, especially one that I listen to even.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.
If you think this episode has been worth even $1, please click the donate button in the upper right corner of our website, shoelesspodcast.com. That is a direct link to my PayPal profile where you can make a donation in any amount. If you don't have PayPal and you want to send a donation through Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, or any other platform, shoot me an email at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com and I'll send you directions for whichever method you prefer. No amount is too small. It all adds up to allow us to keep creating this content for you year after year. And now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom, who just listens to the interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you tell me something to prove that you are my mom?
So I think I was probably one of the first people besides you and Gary who saw the graphic that he created for the podcast back in 2020. And the first time I saw it, I loved it because I thought it was so cool because I could see the locker that was in your living room and knew the story behind how that came to be, and loved the font that he used for the words of my baseball history and the tie-in to Greenville, just everything about it, all the little things. And when you showed me the rough sketch that you handed him to let him know what you were kind of thinking and how he then took that and created this, it's like, this guy's pretty good.
Yeah, that's why he gets paid to do it.
No, it's really cool. And so that's how I became familiar with him. I was not the baseball geek. Well, I don't know that I would be considered a baseball geek now today either, but I've learned a thing or two, forgotten a lot of things as well. But I was thrilled to be able to meet him in person at Sabre this summer. That was really cool. And go up to him and say, "Can I have one of your cards?"
Yeah.
I feel I have a bond with him for being Polish, and I love that you had this great interview with him.
Yeah, when he was telling the story about Eddie Ciecott, and while Gary was doing the research, Eddie Ciecott's name was popping up in Polish language newspapers in Detroit. Yeah. And Gary's like, "And I'm Polish." You rolled your eyes so hard. Like, yeah, we could tell by the by the name.
Yeah, he pointed out a couple people, but when you look at his box set called After the Black Sox, and there's a booklet for each Black Sox player, when he talked about Eddie Ciecott, just going through it and catching the detail of his research to find out what really is the correct pronunciation of Eddie Ciecott's last name. And it's like, this is a kindred spirit for you and me, because you have to know. He nails it.
Well, and it's been mispronounced so many times over the years in movies and pop culture references where they call him Cicotti or all sorts of different variations that we've heard. But his family did still live in Detroit for years afterwards, and they all pronounced it Ciecott. So, like, clearly that's how Eddie, maybe other families who spell it that way pronounce it differently. But we know with 100% certainty, Eddie Ciecott pronounced his own name as Ciecott, thanks to that research. So, yeah. That After the Black Sox set that Gary created is one of my favorite things that's ever been created surrounding the Black Sox scandal, which is why I picked Eddie Ciecott for my team in this episode, and then obviously Shoeless Joe Jackson too. And I've got a few different individual booklets that Gary's made over the years, but there's something even more impressive about his research and his artwork when you see a curated set like that, which has a common theme and all of these stories coming together and like, here's the commonality between them. I love having this set in my collection. It's one of the things that I really genuinely love owning.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's a treasure. I like the way the real card is tucked in the back for as many things as we have both seen relating to the show and the Black Sox. It's really cool to just have this as a little pocket thing almost to have all this detail. And not your normal typical stories. You know, the stories are off the beaten path sometimes. One other example of his deep diving to get the correct pronunciation is, you know, nailing down the name of the Elite Giants in that pronunciation. And the window is closing on a lot of these things because as people pass away, there might not be family members like with Ciecott or players who knew what those teams were called. And it's so important to do that research when that window is still there and listen to the stories and take note.
Well, not just that, it's making sure that you have the oral history because it's documented. Like you can see photos of these guys wearing uniforms that say ELITE. So if you just read that, like for years, I thought it was the Baltimore Elite Giants.
Of course, right.
It wasn't until maybe I think the first time I heard somebody pronounce it Elite might have been Larry Lester or Phil Dixon when they were, you know, I was listening to a podcast or, you know, a YouTube video or something like years ago. And I was like, that's a weird way to pronounce that word. Like, are they just saying it funny? And then I heard another historian say it, and then Bob Kendrick says it, and I'm like, okay, no, like there's something to this.
Right.
And then you find out that is how that team pronounced their name.
Yeah.
So yeah, to hear Gary do that research from people in Baltimore who like knew the guys on that team.
Exactly.
It's important to have that documented orally and not just...
And that's it. He has a gift of listening to people's stories in such a way that they open up to him. And whether it was his exposure to two great storytellers between his grandfather with his Brooklyn Dodgers or his dad and loved the relationship with his dad. But when you're raised in that way and when you enjoy that time and you respect that time and you treasure those stories, you carry that with you so that when you talk to other people, you still have that. So he gets connected to Leon Day. That's great. But what happens after he's connected and the relationship that starts, Leon Day learns to trust him and sees the respect and the thirst for knowledge in telling the stories. Well, that opens up other doors because Leon Day is like, I need you to meet this guy. Or somebody pops in, hey, talk to this kid. He wants to hear what we have to say. That is priceless. And not everyone can just do that. You need to be a special person to have that gift.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what did you think of the Gary Cieradkowski interview?
I'm going to say it again. I felt a kindred spirit because just looking at the research, reading what he writes, I look at the research that you do for the liner notes or when you write different things, the newsletter, I know what the time is behind that. And you can see he puts in the time when he was describing the process of he's got all these files where he just gathers and makes a note. And he could be gathering those notes for years, but he's always thinking until he pulls it together and it's like, okay, now I have something. Now I can run with it. When you asked, well, how do you come up with some of these stories? And he said, I might be researching something else, and I see one line that's tangentially related, but I need to go down there. And it's like, yeah, that leads to even more fascinating stories sometimes than what you even started with. You can just see in what his work is. That's who he is, and it's really great. He said that his goal in what he writes and the stories that he tells is that he wants to tell the stories that you want to tell someone when you're sitting next to them at a bar. He nails it. He nails it in the writing. He nails it in his artwork. And we can see that because it was cool to hear him describe his thought process, why he picked that team, why he presented the person the way he did, and what else was going on in each piece of work. And it was really cool to get his perspective.
Normally, I don't ever talk about what an episode's going to be about with a subject before we sit down because I don't want them to have like rehearsed answers.
Right.
They know why I'm there, so they know what their topic is going to be. But I don't ever want to tell them like, I'm going to ask you this question and we're going to talk about this person. I just want it to be a spontaneous conversation. Whatever comes out, comes out. And sometimes you miss some stories that I know this person tells this story in a nice way. I've heard them tell it a couple times, blah, blah, blah. But if they're not prepared, it might not be top of mind for them. So I might want them to tell a certain story, but if they don't know what I'm getting at,
Right.
Sometimes you lose that. But with Gary, we needed to make sure that the players that I'm picking for my team don't overlap with the players that he's picking for his team. And you're ready to tell these stories because some of these things he wrote about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So just because he did research on it and wrote a story and made a card in 2011, he's not a jukebox.
Right.
Like at the drop of a hat, he might not be ready to tell the story and
Right.
have it be interesting. So I was like, all right, here are the guys who I'm picking. And he doesn't have a list of everybody that he's ever made a card for, but he made a PDF of like a bunch of them. And so I just went through and I have access to his old blogs and I have books that he's written and magazines he's done and all sorts of stuff. So like I had a good idea of people he's created artwork for, not necessarily cards, but artwork at least. Then I put my team together of here's the people that I want to talk about. And he told me here's the team he's selecting. I was like, okay, great. I show up and I've got it all written out and typed out and we're going to do the episode. And then at the end of the episode, he hands me this stack of cards and he's like, here's everybody we just talked about. I was like, oh my God. Like,
Right.
That
Amazing.
absolutely no expectation of that whatsoever.
Yeah.
Like that's not why I drove down to Kentucky to talk to him. Because like you said a second ago, the way he tells stories, it's like he's just telling you something
Right.
sitting at a bar stool. And that had to be the type of episode that this was because we talked about 40 guys.
Right.
So you can't go in depth a 10-minute story about every single person like we do in some of the like the franchise episodes where we talk about the St. Louis Cardinals and we talk about Stan Musial for 12 minutes.
Right.
Like we can't do that in this episode because you're just not going to get through it. And it was already a 3-hour long episode.
Yeah.
But Gary was the perfect person to be like, all right, I did the artwork, so the line notes are going to be cool. I did the research, so the things are interesting, and I talk about them quickly and in a way that is interesting and enthralling. There was no better person for me in my mind to be the episode's guest for this particular topic.
Yeah, and even though your team tended to be people that we generally knew the names of who they were, whenever he added his comments in, it was like, oh, I never heard that story.
Right, that's the whole point.
Especially with that group of characters, you've heard a lot of stories.
Right.
And he just had stories that were off the beaten path.
Yeah.
I loved his excitement when he was talking about Tom Lefty Glover and finding out that that wasn't his real name. As someone who's done Ancestry.com, when you any type of research you do, when you realize you're the one who figured out a key piece like that. And then that opens up the doors and it's like, oh, now I can see. You're opening up another whole pathway into this guy's life. I found him.
Yeah.
That victory in those 3 words was really cool.
Yeah, we heard Larry Lester tell a similar story when he was doing research one time, and he heard from a Negro League player's daughter that, like, that's not how he spelled his name. And that opened up his research to be like, oh, okay, now I can, when I'm searching in the newspapers, like, I can find this reference to him, or, you know, we can credit him the way he's supposed to be credited. Like,
exactly.
Yeah, as a researcher, there's nothing that feels better than uncovering something or being the person to get it right for the first time.
Yeah. I know there were a lot of Shoeless Joe references, and that was kind of cool. There was one that was kind of Shoeless Joe Jackson adjacent, and that was the Ty Cobb story when you were talking about Ty Cobb being a great hitting coach, and I learned something new about that. That was a really great story. But when Gary was talking about how he found out that Ty Cobb was sending out postcards to sports writers, and Grantland Rice wrote about that exercise, which was brilliant, by the way, the first thing I thought of was, oh, Grantland Rice was with Ty Cobb when he stopped in Greenville in the 1940s, and one of his stops was at the Shoeless Joe Jackson liquor store. And Grantland Rice also wrote about that little encounter, and that was a very telling encounter between the 2 men.
Yeah, another thing that I know is Shoeless Joe related that I didn't bring up in the episode, but talking about the Ideal Cap Company out of Cooperstown, they were the ones who made the original hats that the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum vintage team wore during our 1860s vintage-style baseball games against the Ty Cobb Museum. And when I took over the museum in 2019, I tried to reach out to place a new order for hats to match the ones that were made by the museum in 2009 for the inaugural game. But that was the year 2019 that Will passed away, and it just wasn't in the cards for another order to get placed. But I can't tell you how many times people have complimented that hat or asked questions about it when I wear it over the years. And those hats kind of became like a badge of honor for our players because they were only made for that original order. And the only people who had those hats on our team were people who played in the inaugural game.
Yeah.
So as the years went by, fewer and fewer players were wearing those hats on the field because people got old or moved out of the state. Maybe they just aged out or couldn't make it. So originally we had 20 guys on the field wearing that hat. By the last year, it was me and maybe one other guy. But yeah, that was Ideal Cap Company, the company from Cooperstown. So I don't have any of their major or minor league hats that they've created for years, but I've got that one, and that one's pretty special to me.
That is a special one. When Camden Yards was being designed and built, and then when it was unveiled, I loved it. I just loved the concept because it respected the heritage, it respected the history, and saved the buildings around it. How amazing for him as a college junior/senior, right? It was, I think, the summer between his 2 years there. Things happen for a reason, so he goes in for an interview. That company had just landed a contract for the design. The guy doesn't know anything about baseball but wants the commission. And then here is Gary stepping in and speaks the language of Janet Marie Smith, and what a language it is, so that when she makes a reference to, you know, like the font that Comiskey used or whatever the reference is, and he's like, oh yeah, I gotcha. Holy cow.
Yeah.
That's just amazing. What an achievement. I'm sure he's proud of it.
Oh, yeah. We'll talk about right place, right time.
Oh, man.
And the company lucked out that Gary was there for them because how great did he make them look?
Absolutely. I mean, that was like the new standard.
Yeah.
And this was after Comiskey.
Right. After New Comiskey Park was built, Oriole Park was like the next stadium that got built. And everybody in the country was like, oh, they messed up in Chicago.
Absolutely.
Like, they could have done this.
Yeah, absolutely. I was one of those people.
Yeah.
And then also finding out about Gary being colorblind.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a challenge when you're a graphic designer. So he memorizes the Pantone color book.
And he played that down. There are thousands
Yes.
I should have asked him more questions about what type of color blindness he has, because there are people who are just red-green colorblind. There are people who literally are seeing in grayscale, like they only see black and white and shades of black and white. He must have some ability to see some color, because there's no way you can tell the difference between like a light shade of orange and a little slightly darker shade. Like, he's got to be able to do something.
Yeah, I don't know. I was going to say maybe if he has a point of reference, you know, like if he would see like the red that is on the Cincinnati Reds C or whatever. But no, if he can't see red, then he doesn't have that.
But he also mentioned that talking with Greg Kreinler about looking at photos in black and white and trying to decipher based on the shade in the photo what that color would have been.
Yeah,
but,
and what a great partnership that is.
Yeah.
Just to have each other as a reference, and two greats. that was kind of cool to hear.
Oh, yeah. When Gary was talking about Blarney Bill O'Hara, we talked about the idea that there was a grenade that was designed to be the size and the shape of a baseball. And Gary mentioned that the grenade as we know it today was based on the British Mills grenade, but I know that I read about a baseball-sized grenade at one point. So I looked that up to see if I was crazy, and I may be, but not for this reason. The Beano T-13 hand grenade was an experimental grenade developed by the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, that Gary mentioned in the episode during the Mo Berg segment, which later became the CIA. They made this grenade with assistance from Eastman Kodak Corporation in the later years of World War II, and the concept for the grenade was that it was the same size and shape as a traditional baseball, and it was designed to be thrown like a baseball. Because, like Gary talked about, a regular grenade, you kind of lob it.
Yeah.
Well, they designed this Beano T-13 grenade to be thrown the proper way a baseball was thrown because designers believe that emulating a baseball, any young American man should be able to properly throw the grenade with both accuracy and distance. So Gary and I were both right when we talked about that. But then also, Gary told the story of Ted Williams going back to high school after being a well-known baseball star playing for the San Diego Padres. And that's a story that I've heard a bunch of times since moving to Cleveland about Bob Feller. He made his major league debut while he was still in high school, set a couple of strikeout records as a rookie, and then went back to high school for his senior year. He was already such a celebrity because he'd set those records. He'd broken American League long-standing records, and he was such a celebrity that his high school graduation was broadcast on national radio.
Oh my gosh.
So the Ted Williams story was awesome, but it wasn't completely unique.
Yeah.
Something that doesn't happen quite as often anymore. But if you were that great back then, that was something that happened.
Yeah.
Still pretty interesting to hear those stories.
Yeah. Coach, can you sit me so I could go to prom?
Yeah. Of the players that we talked about, the stories that you heard, or the cards that he made of the people that we talked about, do you have a favorite?
I thought the stories that he told about people who were, like the one story where a guy was using a fake name and went out of the country under a fake name, and someone comes after him who's also a fake. Mm-hmm. And so that guy gets arrested, but he did get whoever that player was. So then they both take the ship back to the U.S. to stand up to the music. Yeah, that was Lucky Jack Riley. Mm-hmm. Another story was Dizzy Dean being a mooch and wanting to room with Ducky because he had a great wardrobe. Uh-huh. The backstories are cool. Some you don't know. When I started going through the cards when you first handed them to me, and then I kind of looked through a couple ahead, when I got to Jack Kerouac, I'm like, okay, wait a minute, what? Why is he here? So it was interesting to see how that came up. When you were talking about a sense of humor and how he would put in the Bad News Bears guy, but also talked about Charles Schultz and Joe Schlabotnik. Gary takes it one step further and pays it forward. That was kind of cool.
Yeah, we talked about that in the Bobby Richardson episode. When Bobby Richardson made that catch to end the 1962 World Series, the next peanut strip was Charles Schultz crying that his Giants lost.
Yeah. It's cool to see the personal side of somebody.
Yeah.
It was cool. He seemed like a really nice, down-to-earth guy. So it was great listening to him.
Cool. Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned how there are a handful of ways for you to follow the podcast online. In addition to liking, subscribing, and giving My Baseball History a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, please make sure you're also following us on Facebook, Blue Sky, Twitter, and Instagram, where we are at Shoeless Podcast on each platform. By following us there, you'll get some bonus content throughout the month, including daily posts detailing an important event which happened on this day in baseball history. You'll also be able to interact with us to let us know what you think of the show. If you're a fan of some more long-form posts, you can sign up for Clearing the Bases, our email newsletter, by heading to shoelesspodcast.substack.com. We publish 2 newsletters a month, which allow us to talk about lots of things we don't normally talk about on the show. I use that space to talk about the podcast, of course, but I also use it to write about baseball road trips I go on, to publish research I do, and to speak on current events in baseball, all of which are things I don't really do in episodes of My Baseball History. We'll also have giveaway contests that are exclusively for our newsletter subscribers, giving you even more chances to win some cool stuff. Look for a new issue to be published on the 2nd Friday and the 4th Friday of every month. If you have questions about the podcast or research you'd like to contribute to a future newsletter, submit something through the contact form on our website or email us at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com. Before the interview with Gary, I mentioned a trivia question you can answer to win something. Here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter or Blue Sky at Shoeless Podcast. Then, Find the pinned post at the top of our profile with the link to the Gary Cieradkowski episode, which asks this episode's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in this episode that you just finished listening to. Quote that post along with your answer, and you'll automatically be entered. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll win a signed copy of Gary's book, The League of Outsider Baseball, an illustrated history of baseball's forgotten heroes. We'll reach out to the winner before the next episode of the podcast goes live. You don't have to be the first person to answer. You just have to answer correctly. But make sure you're actually following us on your preferred social media platform, or your entry won't be counted. We also do a separate giveaway related to every episode through our email newsletter, and the winner of that contest gets a different prize. So make sure you're signed up for Clearing the Bases, and you'll have a chance to win something else this month too. During the episode, I posed the question to Gary, who knows what the 1920s would have looked like if Shoeless Joe Jackson was allowed to continue playing in the major leagues? People often bemoan the fact that the Black Sox scandal has kept Shoeless Joe Jackson out of the Hall of Fame. But for most fans, that's the end of their line of thinking. Shoeless Joe doesn't have a plaque because he was banned from baseball. While that is partially true, it's a little more complicated than that. In fact, Joe has actually received Hall of Fame votes twice before, in 1936 and again in 1946, receiving 2 votes apiece in those years. However, his Hall of Fame status aside, I have always been curious exactly what Joe's career would have looked like had he been able to retire on his own terms. So let's take a closer look at how things might have played out, shall we? While Joe never won a batting title during his career, he is widely hailed as the greatest natural hitter in the history of the game. Ty Cobb, the man who single-handedly kept Joe from winning 3 different batting titles in his playing days, praised Joe's skills and ability for decades, even after Joe had passed away. One of those times he was quoted as saying, "I learned a lot watching him. I don't think I ever saw a more perfect swing than Joe's." In the 9 full seasons of Major League Ball that Joe actually played, he finished in the top 4 in the batting race 7 times, including 3 second-place finishes, 2 third-place finishes, and 2 fourth-place finishes. His .356 batting average stood 3rd on the all-time list until recently, when requirements for the number of at-bats needed by American League and National League batters to qualify for the all-time list increased to 5,000 after the inclusion of the Negro League statistics into the Major League record books. Joe's 4,981 career at-bats means he no longer qualifies, missing out by 19 at-bats. Whether that 5,000 at-bat threshold was put in place by Major League Baseball specifically to remove Joe from the all-time list is a topic of discussion for another time. In Charles Comiskey's attempt to build a dynasty on the south side of Chicago, he acquired Joe from Cleveland in August of 1915, just 8 months after he had acquired Eddie Collins from Connie Mack's Philadelphia Athletics. With those 2 superstars now in place, Comiskey had the foundation of a winning ball club for years to come. Joe led the White Sox to the 1917 World Series title over the New York Giants before missing most of the 1918 season due to his military service in World War I. He returned to the White Sox in 1919 when he batted .351 with 96 RBI and only 10 strikeouts in 139 games, putting an exclamation point on a fantastic regular season by hitting a walk-off single to clinch the American League pennant on September 24th against the St. Louis Browns. Unfortunately, Joe's career ended abruptly and prematurely because of his involvement in the infamous Black Sox scandal of the 1919 World Series. What most people fail to realize, however, is that Joe and his teammates had initially gone unpunished and were allowed to play the 1920 season before the scandal fully broke. With a week left to play in the 1920 regular season, the White Sox were a half game back from going to their 3rd World Series in 4 seasons, with the only year that they missed being the war-shortened 1918 season, during which most of their roster was away for the war effort anyways. The dynasty Charles Comiskey was attempting to build was undeniably real. Joe was banned from the game along with 7 of his teammates following the 1920 season, which was the first year of the live ball era. And like I mentioned earlier in this episode, Joe had one of the best years of his career in 1920, setting career highs in home runs and RBI, driving in 121 runs and leading the league with 20 triples. His 218 hits made it the 4th time in his 9 full seasons that he had 200 or more hits, and his .382 batting average was the 3rd highest of his career. But then, with one decision by Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, it all just ended. 1920 was Joe's age 32 season, which sounds like he would be aging out of the game in modern times. But based on his career trajectory, and the careers of his direct contemporaries like Ty Cobb, Tris Speaker, and Rogers Hornsby, it is highly likely that Joe would have played into his 40s had he not been banned by Commissioner Landis. We'll never know for sure what the 1920s would have looked like if Joe was allowed to continue playing in the majors. But when you look at the players I just mentioned, their production skyrocketed during the live ball era compared to their dead ball stats, especially when it came to their batting averages and RBI totals. Ty Cobb batted .371 during his 15 seasons in the dead ball era, averaging 227.8 hits and 102.2 RBI per 162 games. 1920 was his age 33 season, so just a year older than Joe. Ty was coerced into an early retirement in 1926 due to his own betting scandal when it came to light that he fixed a game and attempted to bet on it during the 1919 season. But he came back to play in 1927 and 1928 with the Athletics, retiring after his age 41 season. In his first 3 seasons of the live ball era, Cobb batted .377, averaging 236.8 hits and 113 RBI per 162, all significant increases from his dead ball numbers. All told, in the 9 seasons he played during the live ball era, Cobb batted .357, averaging 216.4 hits and 106.6 RBI per 162, and adding 41.6 WAR to bring his career total to 151.4, which is 6th all-time. Tris Speaker batted .338 during his 13 seasons in the dead ball era, averaging 201.9 hits and 80.5 RBI per 162 games. 1920 was his age 32 season also, which was the same exact age as Joe. Tris, funnily enough, was also coerced into an early retirement in 1926 due to that same betting scandal involving Ty Cobb, which is now known as the Dutch Leonard affair. Speaker, like Cobb, came back to play in 1927 and 1928, retiring after his age 40 season. In his first 4 years of the live ball era, Speaker batted .377, averaging 223.3 hits and 110.2 RBI per 162, all massive jumps from his dead ball stats. All told, in the 9 seasons he played during the live ball era, Speaker batted .354, averaging 207.1 hits and 100.5 RBI per 162, and adding 52.2 WAR to bring his career total to 134.9, which is 9th all-time. Speaker once said about Joe, "I can't even remember him being in a batting slump. His swing was so perfect that there was little chance of it getting disorganized. He was the greatest natural hitter who ever lived." Rogers Hornsby batted .310 during his 5 seasons in the dead ball era, averaging 181 hits and 77.6 RBI per 162 games. 1920 was his age 24 season, so he was 8 years younger than Joe, meaning he was just about to enter his athletic prime when the live ball era began. He went on to play through 1937, retiring after his age 41 season. In his first 4 seasons of the live ball era, Hornsby batted .389, averaging 248.7 hits and 130.7 RBI per 162, all astronomically higher than his dead ball stats. All told, in the 18 seasons he played during the live ball era, Hornsby batted .374, averaging 219.6 hits and 125.3 RBI per 162, adding 100.8 WAR to bring his career total to 127.3, which is 12th all-time. Now, due to Hornsby's age being so different from Joe's, Ty's, and Tris's, it's not quite fair to compare his live ball production to theirs, or to use it as a gauge to estimate what Joe would have done had his career been able to play out naturally. However, the point can still be made that at that time in baseball history, players of their caliber continued their careers until they were in their 40s. Like Cobb and Speaker, Napoleon Lajoie also retired at 41, but Eddie Collins and Hannes Wagner played even longer, each retiring at 43. If you were at that skill level, and, if you didn't get banned from baseball, you played a long time back then. Let's take a look at Joe's numbers in the live ball era compared to the dead ball era like we just did with the other guys. Joe batted .352 during his 12 seasons in the dead ball era, averaging 212.3 hits and 91.7 RBI per 162 games. 1920 was his age 32 season, meaning he most likely had another 9 or 10 full seasons left in him had he not been banned. In his only season of the live ball era, Jackson batted .382 and was on pace for 241.9 hits and 132.3 RBI per 162. Those numbers are perfectly in line with the increases Hornsby and Cobb saw in their statistics, accounting for the fact that Joe only played one season in the live ball era, and his stats would have most likely started to come slightly back down to earth in years 2 through 4 had he been allowed to play them. As it were, Joe's career ended with 1,772 hits. If he plays for another 9 seasons and is able to retire after his age 41 season, we're looking at an addition of somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,524 hits. But what am I basing that off of? Since Cobb averaged 216.4 hits per 162 and Speaker averaged 207.1 in their live ball careers, I'm saying Joe's going to be right at about 211. I'm also assuming he plays an average of just 130 games per season, which is exactly what Speaker averaged in his live ball career. When his career ended, Joe had been averaging 142.8 games per season. But of course, as you age, you play a few less games per year, injuries happen, things like that. So we're going to knock that number down to 130 to account for that. Those trajectories would have given Joe 3,296 career hits, which would put him 13th all-time. If he plays a 10th full year, retiring after his age 42 season, and picks up another 90 hits in that final season, that gives him 3,386 hits and moves him up to 10th all-time today. As things currently stand, Cobb is 2nd all-time, Speaker is 5th, and Hornsby is 40th. As of today, there have been 33 players in Major League Baseball history who have collected 3,000 hits. But at the time Joe would have crossed that threshold, which I project would have most likely been in late 1926 or possibly early 1927, he would have been just the 7th player in history with 3,000. The only 6 ahead of him at that point would have been Cap Anson in July of 1897, Hannes Wagner in June of 1914, Napoleon Lajoie in September of 1914, Ty Cobb in August of 1921, Tris Speaker in May of 1925, and Eddie Collins in June of 1925. Joe's career ended with 792 RBI. If he would have played for another 9 seasons instead of being banned following the 1920 season, he would have added another roughly 748 runs batted in, assuming he splits the difference between Cobb and Speaker's live ball season averages like he did during their dead ball careers. That would have given Joe 1,540 career runs batted in, which would put him tied for 49th all time. If he doesn't retire until after his age 42 season and picks up another 35 runs batted in that year, that gives him 1,575 and moves him up to 46th all time. As things currently stand, Cobb is 9th all time, Hornsby is tied for 42nd, and Speaker is 51st. Joe's career ended with 62.2 wins above replacement. If he would have played for another 9 seasons and added another 40.9 WAR, he would have ended his career with 103.1, which would be good for 29th all time and 20th among position players. Based on his actual numbers and on the things his contemporaries said about him, it is clear that Joe was one of the greatest players who ever lived. But all of that aside, instead of feeling sorry for Joe, that he was robbed of what could have been one of the all-time great careers, ending with a surefire spot in the Hall of Fame, we should feel sorry for baseball, and more importantly, for baseball fans. Instead of the Yankees dominating the American League with 6 pennants in the 1920s, Joe Jackson and the White Sox dynasty that Charles Comiskey had built would have been New York's heated rival for the duration of the decade. The two would have spent the entire decade fighting for pennants and creating unforgettable moments that we would still be talking about today. Babe Ruth said, "I copied Jackson's batting style because I thought he was the greatest hitter I'd ever seen, the greatest natural hitter I ever saw. I still think the same way. He's the guy who made me a hitter." Imagine what the 1920s would have looked like with those two going at it head to head. It's a shame that Joe wasn't able to finish his career on his own terms, and we'll never know what his true statistics would have looked like had he been able to. But I can promise you this, he would absolutely have a plaque in Cooperstown alongside all of his peers, who called him the greatest. Don't forget, it's a huge help when you rate and review My Baseball History wherever you listen to the podcast. 5-star ratings help our show get featured on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means more people will have a chance to discover it. It just takes a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us a lot. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends or family is great too. Feel free to send this episode to anyone in your life who loves baseball, or loves telling interesting stories to strangers while they're sitting at a bar. Hopefully they'll enjoy it, and maybe they'll even learn a thing or two. But no matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is my baseball history.